Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The White Shadow at Gallytrot. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was somehow appropriate, as Tuesdays had always seemed to Ernest Blackwood to be the most neutral of days, neither the desperate optimism of Monday nor the weary relief of Friday, but merely a gray interval between beginnings and endings, a day that passed without leaving marks. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick and cream-colored, with a watermark that showed a stag's head in profile when held to the light. The return address was in Suffolk, a county that Ernest associated with flat landscapes and Roman ruins, and the particular melancholy of East Anglian skies that seemed to press down upon the earth with a weight that was more psychological than meteorological. He opened it at his kitchen table in Hackney, over a cup of tea that had gone cold while he graded papers. He was a historian by trade, or had been once, before the scandal at Cambridge had made him unemployable in any institution that valued its reputation. Now he taught night classes at a community college, lecturing on Gothic architecture to students who were more interested in the ghosts that might haunt cathedrals than in the engineering principles that allowed them to stand. He was 47 years old, divorced, childless, and in possession of a small flat that smelled of old books and the particular loneliness of men who had chosen their work over their lives, and were only now beginning to understand the cost of that choice. The letter was from a solicitor in Bury St. Edmunds, and it concerned an estate, Thorpe Morley to be precise, a property that Ernest had heard mentioned exactly twice in his life, both times by his mother, both times in tones of such strained neutrality that he had understood, even as a child, that the subject was forbidden. His mother's uncle had lived there. His mother's uncle had been a monster, or a saint, or perhaps merely a man who had loved solitude more than family, depending on which relative was telling the story. Ernest had never met him. The uncle had died 6 months ago alone, without heirs, and the estate had passed to Ernest as the last surviving member of a branch of the family that his mother had deliberately allowed to wither. The property included a manor house, the solicitor wrote, though house was perhaps too generous a term. It included a collapsed chapel, a series of limestone ruins, and approximately 40 acres of land that ranged from cultivated garden to wild wood. The estate was in poor condition, had been in poor condition for decades, and would require substantial investment to restore to habitability. However, the will contained one bizarre caveat that the solicitor felt compelled to bring to Ernest's attention. "Never turn your back on the White Shadow," the will read in the deceased's own shaky hand, appended to the formal document as a codicil. "For the Gallytrot feeds on the distance created by fear. Stand your ground and it cannot touch you. Show it your heels, and you have already written your own epitaph." Ernest read the words 3 times. Then he laughed, a dry sound that had more bitterness than humor in it. His uncle had been mad, clearly. The isolation of rural Suffolk, the decay of old age, the particular loneliness of a man who had outlived everyone who might have kept him tethered to reality. Any of these could explain the paranoid delusion of a white shadow that hunted the fearful. Ernest had spent his career studying the folklore of East Anglia, the stories of black dogs and will-o'-the-wisps, and the countless other spirits that haunted the flatlands. He knew that such legends often arose from the conjunction of isolation and imagination, from the tendency of the human mind to populate empty spaces with threats that made the emptiness bearable. But he also knew that the property was worth something. Not a fortune, perhaps, but enough to clear his debts, to fund a few years of independent research, to give him the breathing room he needed to rebuild a life that had been steadily contracting since the scandal. The Cambridge affair had been about plagiarism, or rather the accusation of plagiarism, a charge that had been technically true but materially unfair. Ernest had borrowed from his own earlier, unpublished work, not from anyone else's, but the university had seized upon the technicality with the enthusiasm of an institution that had been looking for an excuse to be rid of him. His tenure had been revoked, his pension confiscated, his name added to a blacklist that circulated among academic hiring committees with the efficiency of gossip in a small town. He needed this inheritance. He needed the money, the space, the distance from London and its memories. And perhaps, if he was honest with himself in the small hours when sleep wouldn't come, he needed the mystery. The scandal had destroyed his reputation as a scholar, but it had not destroyed his curiosity. The Gallytrot, whatever it was a piece of folklore that had not been documented in any of the standard references. It was a story that had not been told, a legend that had not been catalogued, a ghost that had not been laid. And Ernest Blackwood, despite everything, was still a man who chased ghosts. He wrote to the solicitor, accepting the inheritance. He gave notice at the community college, packed his books into boxes that he shipped ahead, and boarded a train at Liverpool Street Station on a Thursday morning in late October, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the wind carried the first intimations of winter from the North Sea. The journey took 3 hours, passing through landscapes that grew progressively flatter, progressively emptier, progressively older. The towns gave way to villages, the villages to hamlets, the hamlets to isolated farmhouses that seemed to cling to the earth with the desperation of survivors who had watched everything around them disappear. And finally, after a taxi ride from the nearest station that covered 12 miles of single-track road bordered by hedgerows that scraped the car's paint, Ernest arrived at Thorpe Morley. The gate was rusted iron, hanging from hinges that had surrendered to corrosion decades ago. Beyond it, a drive of crushed shell and gravel led through overgrown rhododendrons to a house that emerged from the landscape like a fossil surfacing from sediment. It was Georgian, or perhaps earlier, a symmetrical facade of red brick that had faded to the color of dried blood, with windows that stared blankly at the approaching visitor like the eye sockets of a skull. The roof was missing tiles in patterns that suggested deliberate removal rather than natural decay, and one of the chimneys had collapsed, leaving a jagged stump that pointed at the sky like an accusation. But it was the ruins that drew Ernest's attention. To the east of the house, visible beyond a stand of dead elm trees, was a structure that had once been a chapel. Now it was merely walls, 4 walls of limestone that rose to varying heights and enclosed a space that was open to the sky. The walls were weathered smooth, their surfaces covered in lichen that glowed faintly yellow-green in the afternoon light. And they were old, far older than the house, perhaps older than Christianity itself, built from stones that had been shaped by hands that understood something about weight and balance that modern architecture had forgotten. Ernest stood in the gravel drive and felt the silence settle around him like a dust that had been waiting for a disturbance. It was the silence of abandonment, yes, but also something else. Something that felt almost anticipatory, as if the estate had been holding its breath since his uncle's death, waiting for the next occupant to arrive and reawaken whatever slept here. He found the keys under a flower pot on the doorstep, exactly where the solicitor had said they would be. The front door opened with a creak that sounded loud in the stillness, and Ernest stepped into a hallway that smelled of damp plaster, old wood, and the particular mustiness of a house that had been closed for months. His footsteps echoed on the floorboards as he explored, finding rooms that were furnished but untouched, as if his uncle had simply stopped using them one day and never returned. A sitting room with a fireplace full of cold ash, a kitchen with jars of preserves that had turned to science experiments on the shelves, a study lined with books that Ernest immediately recognized as the collection of a serious scholar of folklore and local history. His uncle had been researching something, and the research had consumed him. And upstairs, at the end of a corridor that was darker than the rest of the house, was the bedroom where his uncle had died. The bed was unmade, the sheets still bearing the impression of a body that had lain there for weeks before being discovered. On the nightstand was a journal, its pages filled with handwriting that grew progressively shakier as the entries progressed, and a photograph in a silver frame that showed a young man, Ernest's uncle, he assumed, standing in front of the chapel ruins with an expression that was neither happy nor sad but merely watchful, as if he were waiting for something to appear at the edge of the frame. Ernest picked up the journal and began to read. The early entries were mundane, gardening notes, weather observations, complaints about the difficulty of finding reliable help in rural Suffolk. But as the entries progressed, they shifted. They began to speak of things seen at twilight, of shapes that moved at the corner of vision, of a white shadow that appeared in the garden on nights when the moon was full and the wind was still. "It is not a dog," the journal read in an entry dated March 14, 3 months before the uncle's death. "It is not a cow, though it is the size of one. It is white, utterly white, the white of bone and frost and the absence of blood. Its edges blur as if it is not quite in focus, not quite in phase with the rest of reality. And its eyes, dear God, its eyes, they do not reflect light. They produce it. A red glow that seems to come from somewhere inside the creature, somewhere deeper than any anatomy can explain." Ernest read on, his academic interest warring with a growing unease that he couldn't quite dismiss as imagination. The journal described encounters that became progressively more frequent and progressively more disturbing. The creature appeared at the edge of the woods, watching the house. It appeared in the garden, standing motionless among the roses. It appeared in the ruins of the chapel, its blurred form flickering like a candle flame in a draught. And every time it appeared, someone died. Not in the house, not on the estate, but in the nearby village of Thorpe Parva, someone would suffer a sudden, inexplicable death within 24 hours of the sighting, a stroke, a heart attack, a freak accident that defied explanation. The local doctor, his uncle wrote, had stopped asking questions. The villagers had stopped talking about it, but they knew. They all knew. The white shadow was the herald, and its appearance meant that death was making his rounds. "I have tried to stand my ground," the journal continued in an entry dated May 2. "I have walked toward it as the old stories advise. I have refused to run, refused to show fear, refused to give it the distance it craves. And it works. When I stand still, when I face it directly, it does not approach. It merely watches, its red eyes glowing, its blurred edges vibrating with a patience that seems eternal. But I am an old man, and my courage is not what it was. I know that one night, one dark night when the wind is howling and the loneliness is more than I can bear, I will turn. I will run. And on that night the Gallytrot will finally have what it has been waiting for." The final entry was dated 3 days before the uncle's death. It was 3 words long. "It knows now." Ernest closed the journal and looked out the window at the garden, where the afternoon light was fading into a twilight that seemed to arrive early, as if the estate were operating on a different schedule than the rest of the world. He told himself that his uncle had been ill, perhaps senile, certainly paranoid. He told himself that the correlation between the creature's appearances and the village deaths was coincidence, confirmation bias, the tendency of the human mind to find patterns in randomness. He told himself these things with the fervor of a man who had built his career on the demolition of superstition, who had published papers proving that every ghost story in East Anglia had a rational explanation. But his hands were shaking as he set the journal down, and when he looked out the window again, he thought he saw something move at the edge of the woods. It was dusk, the time when the boundaries between things grew thin, when the eye could be tricked by shadows and the mind could be seduced by suggestion. Ernest pressed his face against the glass, peering into the gloom that was gathering beneath the dead elms, and felt his breath catch in his throat. There was something there, something the size of a bull, perhaps larger, its form indistinct, its edges vibrating in a way that made his eyes water and his stomach clench. It was white, not the white of snow or of moonlight, but a stark, absolute white that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it, a white that was the color of absence, of negation, of the space between atoms where nothing existed. And its eyes, 2 points of red light, steady and unblinking, floating in the blur of its face like embers in a fog. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They simply watched with a patience that was older than the house, older than the chapel, older than the human concept of time. Ernest felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the chill of being seen by something that was not human, something that did not think or feel or want in any way that he could understand. It was the chill of encountering a phenomenon that his entire framework of knowledge was inadequate to process. He was looking at something that should not exist, and the fact that he was looking at it meant that the world was larger and stranger than he had ever allowed himself to believe. But he was also, despite everything, a scholar, a man of curiosity, a creature of questions rather than fears. And as he stood at the window, his heart hammering, his palms sweating against the cold glass, he found that his primary emotion was not terror but fascination. The Gallytrot was real, not as a dog or a cow or any known animal, but as something else, something that occupied a category of its own, that moved through the world according to rules that had nothing to do with biology or physics or any of the sciences that he had spent his life studying. It was a living contradiction, a paradox made flesh, a creature that was simultaneously here and not here, visible and invisible, present and absent. And it was watching him. Ernest did not run. He remembered the journal, remembered the caveat in the will, remembered the old stories about standing one's ground. He stood at the window and met the creature's gaze with a determination that surprised him. He was afraid, terrified, in fact, but he was also stubborn. The same stubbornness that had carried him through the scandal, through the divorce, through the long years of professional exile. He would not run. He would not give the creature the satisfaction of his fear. They stood like that for what felt like minutes but might have been hours. The light failed completely, and the Gallytrot became merely 2 red eyes floating in the darkness. And then those 2 faded, not by moving away but by simply ceasing to be visible, as if the creature had stepped sideways into a dimension that Ernest's eyes could not access. When he could no longer see it, he stepped back from the window and realized that his legs were trembling so badly he could barely stand. He made his way to the kitchen, found a bottle of whiskey in a cabinet, and drank 2 fingers of it straight from the neck. The burn steadied him, reminded him that he was still corporeal, still alive, still operating according to the rules of a world that did not include white shadows with glowing red eyes. But he knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that he had not imagined what he had seen. And he knew, with equal certainty, that the Gallytrot would be back. It had found a new occupant for Thorpe Morley, and it was waiting to see what kind of man Ernest Blackwood really was. The whiskey finished, he climbed the stairs to his uncle's bedroom and lay down on the bed that was still indented with the shape of a dead man's final rest. He did not sleep. He lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the estate, the creaking of old wood, the scratching of branches against glass, the distant hooting of an owl that might have been merely an owl or might have been something else entirely. And he waited for the dawn, knowing that the creature was still out there, still watching, still patient. The Gallytrot had all the time in the world, and Ernest Blackwood, whether he knew it or not, had just become its newest project. The days that followed Ernest's first sighting of the Gallytrot passed in a state of suspended tension that was almost worse than direct confrontation. He threw himself into the work of cataloging the estate, measuring the ruins, photographing the chapel walls for the research paper he told himself he would eventually write. He kept busy, kept moving, kept his eyes on the immediate tasks of restoration and documentation. But everywhere he went, he felt the creature's presence. Not as a physical threat, not as an immediate danger, but as a weight in the air, a pressure against his thoughts, a constant reminder that he was not alone, that he was being watched, that something was waiting for him to make a mistake. He explored the ruins of the chapel on the second day, measuring the limestone walls with a tape and recording his findings in a leather-bound notebook that had belonged to his uncle. The chapel was older than he had initially estimated, not medieval, but prehistoric, built on a site that had been sacred long before Christianity arrived in East Anglia. The walls were not mortared but dry stacked, each stone fitted to its neighbors with a precision that suggested advanced engineering or perhaps merely centuries of patient adjustment by hands that had nothing but time. And on the interior surfaces, barely visible beneath the lichen and the weathering, were carvings. Ernest photographed them with his phone, his academic instincts temporarily overriding his fear. They were not Christian symbols. They were older, stranger images that seemed to depict a creature that was simultaneously animal and abstract, a white shape with blurred edges, surrounded by smaller figures that were running away from it. The running figures had no faces, their features worn away by time or perhaps deliberately erased, but their postures conveyed a terror that was unmistakable even after millennia. And in the center of each carving, above the white shape, was a symbol that Ernest didn't recognize, a spiral that tightened inward toward a point of darkness, like an eye or a doorway or a mouth. He touched the carvings with his fingertips, feeling the texture of the weathered stone, and felt something shift in the air around him. A pressure change, a sudden drop in temperature, a sense that the ruins were no longer merely ruins but had become something else, something active, something aware. He looked up. The Gallytrot was standing at the eastern corner of the chapel, its blurred form partially obscured by the remains of a fallen pillar. It was closer than it had been in the garden, close enough that Ernest could see details that his first sighting had not revealed. The creature was the size of a large bull, but its proportions were wrong. Its legs were too long, its body too narrow, its head too small for the bulk of its shoulders. The white of its coat or skin or whatever covered it was not uniform but seemed to shift and flow, like milk stirred by an invisible hand, like smoke frozen in the shape of a beast. And the eyes were not merely glowing now. They were focused. They were intent. They were looking at Ernest with an expression that he could not read but that made his stomach clench with a primal, animal fear. Ernest stood very still. He remembered the journal, the will, the old stories. Stand your ground. Do not run. The Gallytrot feeds on the distance created by fear. He repeated these words to himself like a mantra, a prayer, a shield against the terror that was rising in his throat like bile. The creature took a step forward. Its movement was wrong, somehow. Not the fluid gait of a quadruped but a stuttering, glitching progression, as if it existed in multiple positions simultaneously, and his eye was struggling to resolve the contradiction. It seemed to flicker, to skip frames, to move in a way that violated the smooth continuity of physical reality. Ernest's courage wavered. He had faced academic adversaries, institutional bullies, the contempt of colleagues who had once been friends, but he had never faced something that his mind could not categorize, that his knowledge could not explain, that his rationality could not contain. The Gallytrot was not an argument to be refuted or a theory to be tested. It was a presence, a force, a being that operated according to laws that he did not understand and perhaps could not understand. And it was getting closer. Ernest took a step backward. He didn't mean to. His body acted before his mind could intervene, his survival instincts overriding his intellectual resolve. The step was small, almost involuntary, a retreat of perhaps 6 inches, but the effect on the creature was immediate and devastating. The Gallytrot's head snapped up. Its eyes blazed brighter, the red deepening to a shade that was almost purple, almost black, and it moved. Not toward him, not directly, but around him, circling the ruins with a speed that was impossible for its bulk, a speed that suggested it was not moving through space but across it, skipping the intervening distance like a stone skipping across water. In seconds it had positioned itself between Ernest and the path that led back to the house, cutting off his retreat. And then it stopped, and it waited. Ernest's mind raced. The creature was blocking his escape. It had him cornered in the ruins, surrounded by walls that were too high to climb and too old to trust, and it was waiting for something, waiting for him to make the next move, waiting for him to run. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Gallytrot wasn't attacking, it was hunting, and hunting required flight. The creature couldn't or wouldn't harm him unless he ran, unless he created the distance that activated its predatory instincts. It was waiting for him to bolt, to panic, to give it the excuse it needed to chase. Ernest stood in the center of the ruins, his heart hammering, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and fought the most intense battle of his life. His body wanted to run. Every nerve, every muscle, every instinct screamed at him to flee, to escape, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the blurred white shape that blocked his path. But his mind, his stubborn, rational, terrified mind, held him in place. He would not run. He would not give the creature what it wanted. He would stand his ground if it killed him. The Gallytrot watched him. Its blurred edges vibrated with an intensity that suggested impatience, or anticipation, or perhaps merely curiosity. It had expected him to run. They always ran. And now this one was refusing, was defying the ancient contract between predator and prey, was standing in the ruins with his fists clenched and his jaw set, and his eyes fixed on the creature with an expression that was almost challenge. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind blew through the ruins, carrying the smell of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. A crow called from somewhere in the elms, and the Gallytrot and the man stared at each other across a distance of perhaps 20 feet, locked in a stalemate that neither knew how to break. Then the creature moved, not toward Ernest but away, sidestepping with that stuttering, frame-skipping gait until it had cleared the path. It was letting him go. It was giving him a chance to walk away. But its eyes never left his, and in their red glow there was a promise that Ernest understood with perfect clarity. This was not over. The hunt had been activated. Ernest had shown fear, had taken that backward step, however small, and the Gallytrot had registered it. The creature was now tethered to him, bound to him by the ancient law of flight and pursuit. It would follow him. It would wait for him to run again. And sooner or later, inevitably, he would. Ernest walked past the creature with a deliberation that cost him everything he had. He didn't run. He didn't hurry. He placed one foot in front of the other with the mechanical precision of a man walking to his own execution, and he didn't look back until he had reached the garden, until the house was in sight, until the door was within reach. When he finally did look back, the ruins were empty. The Gallytrot was gone, but the path between the chapel and the house was longer than it should have been, the elms arranged in configurations that he didn't remember, the shadows falling at angles that suggested a sun that was in the wrong part of the sky. The creature had not merely watched him. It had changed something. It had shifted the landscape in ways that were subtle but undeniable, leaving its mark on the estate as a reminder that the hunt was on. Ernest locked the door behind him and leaned against it, his body shaking, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. He had survived. He had stood his ground. But he had also, in that moment of weakness, that involuntary backward step, signed a contract that he didn't know how to break. The Gallytrot was coming for him, not immediately, not directly, but eventually. It would wait, it would watch. It would chip away at his courage with patience that was older than human fear. And when he finally broke, when the isolation and the darkness and the constant pressure became too much, it would be there, ready, hungry, patient beyond measure. That night Ernest didn't sleep. He sat in his uncle's study with every light in the house burning, surrounded by books that suddenly seemed like talismans against the dark. He read the journal again, more carefully this time, looking for any clue that might help him understand what he was facing. And in the early hours of the morning, when the house had settled into its nocturnal creaking and the wind had died to a whisper, he found something. In a drawer beneath the desk, hidden beneath a false bottom that his uncle had apparently believed would protect his secrets, was a second journal. Not the daily diary of a frightened old man, but a research notebook, filled with drawings and maps and references to sources that Ernest didn't recognize. The first page bore a title in his uncle's careful hand, The Gallytrot, a study in predatory spatial geometry. Ernest read with growing fascination and horror. His uncle had not merely observed the creature. He had studied it. He had mapped its appearances, recorded its movements, analyzed its behavior with the rigor of a naturalist observing a species that had never been catalogued. And he had reached conclusions that were as disturbing as they were inescapable. The Gallytrot was not a creature of flesh and blood, not in the conventional sense. It was a manifestation of spatial distortion, a being that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensions, that moved through the world by folding space rather than traversing it. The blurring of its edges was not a visual effect, but a physical one. The creature was literally out of phase with the surrounding reality, existing in multiple locations simultaneously, and resolving into a single form only when observed. And the treasure it guarded, the hidden treasure that the old stories spoke of, was not gold or jewels or any material wealth. It was breath, life, the souls of those who had died fleeing the beast. Ernest turned page after page, his hands shaking. His uncle had discovered that the Gallytrot did not kill its victims directly. It chased them until their hearts gave out, until their bodies collapsed from exhaustion, until their final breath was expelled in a scream of terror. And that breath, that last exhalation of life, was what the creature collected. It was a harvester of endings, a gatherer of final moments, and the treasure it guarded was a collection of stolen souls that it stored in the spaces between dimensions, in the folds of reality where human senses could not follow. The creature is a manifestation of cowardice and death, the journal read. It cannot harm you if you stand your ground, if you face it without fear, if you refuse to give it the distance it craves. But the moment you exhibit the desire to be elsewhere, the moment you turn, the moment you run, the moment you even think about escape, you activate the hunt. And once activated, the hunt cannot be stopped. The Gallytrot will follow you through walls, through time, through the very fabric of space itself. It will fold the world until the distance between you and it becomes zero, and in that moment it will take your breath, your life, your soul, and add you to its collection. Ernest read the final entry, written in a hand that was barely legible, the letters shaky and sprawling as if written in the grip of a fever or a terror that could not be controlled. I have tried to find a way to defeat it. I have consulted every text, every grimoire, every fragment of folklore that mentions the Gallytrot or its analogues in other cultures, and the answer is always the same. You cannot kill it, you cannot trap it, you cannot escape it. The only way to survive is to never activate the hunt, and I have already activated it. I ran. 3 nights ago in the garden I ran. I am tethered now. I am marked. And it is only a matter of time. The entry ended there. Ernest turned the page, hoping for more, but the rest of the notebook was blank. His uncle had written his final words 3 days before his death, and then he had stopped. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because saying it would have made it real. Ernest sat in the study, surrounded by the books and the journals and the evidence of a man's final, desperate attempt to understand the thing that was killing him. And he understood with a clarity that made him want to scream that he had made the same mistake. That backward step in the ruins, that involuntary retreat, that moment of fear, it had been enough. The hunt was activated, the tether was formed, and the Gallytrot, patient and eternal and absolutely committed to its purpose, would not rest until it had claimed him. But there was one thing his uncle had not tried, one thing that the journal did not mention, that the folklore did not record, that the old stories whispered only in their silences and their gaps. If running activated the hunt, and standing still kept the creature at bay, what would happen if you walked toward it? Not merely stood your ground, not merely refused to flee, but actively approached, closed the distance, erased the space between yourself and the predator. What would happen to a hunt that depended on flight if the prey refused to fly? Ernest didn't know. No one knew. It was a question that had never been answered because no one had ever been desperate enough to ask it. But Ernest Blackwood, disgraced historian, failed husband, lonely man in a lonely house, was beginning to understand desperation. And he was beginning to think that he might be the first person in history desperate enough to find out. The wind rose outside, carrying a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a whisper, and somewhere in the folds of the estate, in the spaces between the walls and the world, the Gallytrot waited for the next chapter of the hunt to begin. The Gallytrot did not attack immediately. That was the most terrible thing about it. The patience, the deliberation, the exquisite, drawn-out cruelty of a predator that had eternity at its disposal and saw no reason to rush. In the days following Ernest's fatal backward step in the chapel ruins, the creature made its presence known not through violence but through proximity. It was simply there, always there, a white blur at the corner of his vision, a flicker of red light in the darkness outside his windows, a weight in the air that made the house feel smaller and the nights feel longer. Ernest tried to live normally. He ate meals that he didn't taste, read books that he couldn't remember, slept in fits and starts that left him more exhausted than wakefulness. He kept the lights burning at all hours, a fortress of illumination against the darkness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. But the darkness was not the enemy. The enemy was already inside, had been inside since the moment he took that step backward, since the moment he activated the hunt. The creature began to speak on the fourth night. Ernest was in the kitchen, trying to force down a piece of toast that had gone cold while he stared at it, when he heard a voice from the garden. It was his mother's voice, clear and warm and utterly impossible, calling his name in the tone she had used when he was a child, when she had tucked him into bed and told him stories about the saints and the heroes and the monsters that lived in the woods beyond the village. "Ernest, Ernest, come outside. I've made your favorite. I've come to take you home." Ernest's hand froze halfway to his mouth. The toast fell from his fingers and landed butterside down on the floor, but he didn't notice. He was staring at the kitchen window, where the darkness outside seemed to have thickened, to have gathered itself into a shape that pressed against the glass with an urgency that was almost tender. "Mum," the word escaped before he could stop it, before his rational mind could assert control. "Mum, is that? Come outside, darling. It's cold in there. Come out where it's warm. Come out where I can see you." Ernest stood up. His body was moving without his permission, his legs carrying him toward the door, his hand reaching for the latch. The voice was so real, so achingly, impossibly real, that the part of his mind that knew it was a trick was overwhelmed by the part that had been waiting 30 years to hear his mother call him home. He touched the latch, and then he stopped. The Gallytrot didn't know his mother. It had never met her, never heard her, never possessed the sensory data required to reproduce her voice with such fidelity. But it had access to something else, to Ernest's memories, his desires, his deepest longings. It was mining his mind, extracting the voices that lived in his head and playing them back with a precision that was more terrifying than any physical attack could have been. "You're not my mother," he said, his voice shaking. "My mother is dead. She died 12 years ago. And you're something else. Something that wants me to open this door. Something that wants me to step outside. Something that wants me to run." The voice laughed. It was his mother's laugh exactly perfectly, the warm chuckle that had greeted his childhood triumphs and soothed his childhood fears. "Don't be silly, Ernest. I'm right here. Just open the door. Just take one step. That's all it takes, darling. Just one step and then we can go home together." Ernest's hand tightened on the latch. The metal was cold, so cold it burned, and the sensation anchored him, reminded him that he was still in his body, still in his kitchen, still in a world where the dead did not speak and mothers did not return from beyond the grave to fetch their middle-aged sons. He pulled his hand back and stepped away from the door, and as he did, the voice changed. It was no longer his mother. It was his ex-wife, Catherine, her voice sharp with the particular contempt she had developed in the final years of their marriage. "Coward," she spat. "You're still a coward, Ernest. You couldn't face me, so you ran to this godforsaken hole in the ground. And now you can't even face a dog in the dark. You're pathetic. You're worthless. You might as well open the door and let it take you, because there's nothing left to save." Ernest pressed his hands over his ears, but the voice wasn't external. It was inside him, resonating in the same hollow spaces where the Gallytrot's presence had taken up residence. He stumbled backward into the kitchen table, knocking over a chair that clattered to the floor with a sound that was deafening in the otherwise absolute silence. "Shut up," he whispered. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." "Make me," the voice said, and now it was his own voice, his own thoughts played back to him with a mocking inflection that made his stomach twist. "Make me shut up, Ernest. Make me stop. But you can't, can you? Because I'm not out there, I'm in here. I'm the part of you that knows what you really are. I'm the part that knows you're going to run. I'm the part that's already counting the steps." He fled the kitchen. Not outside. He knew better than to go outside, knew that the garden was the creature's territory, knew that stepping into the dark would be the end of everything. But he fled upstairs to his bedroom, to the bed with its sheets that still bore the impression of his dead uncle's body. He pulled the covers over his head and lay in the darkness, shaking, sweating, his heart hammering a rhythm that felt like a countdown. The voice followed him. It spoke from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very fabric of the house. It used every voice he had ever loved, every voice he had ever feared, every voice that had power over him. His father disappointed, his doctoral advisor dismissive, the dean of Cambridge pronouncing sentence. Catherine again and again telling him that he had wasted his life, wasted her life, wasted every opportunity that had ever been offered to him. And then on the fifth night, the scenarios began. Ernest woke to the smell of smoke. Not the pleasant smoke of a fireplace or a wood stove, but the acrid, chemical smell of burning plastic and fabric, the smell of a house that was on fire. He sat up, his heart already racing, and saw orange light flickering beneath his bedroom door. Fire, the house was on fire. He could hear it now, the crackling of flames, the popping of wood as it split under intense heat, the groaning of structural timbers that were beginning to fail. He threw off the covers and ran to the door, pressing his palm against the wood. It was hot, burning hot, and on the other side he could hear the fire roaring, could feel the draft of superheated air that was being drawn toward the flames. He had to get out. That was the only thought his mind could hold. Out, downstairs, through the kitchen, through the garden, into the open air where he could breathe, where he could survive, where he could escape the inferno that was consuming the house around him. His hand found the doorknob. It was scalding, and he jerked his hand back with a cry of pain. But the fire was getting louder, closer, hungrier. He wrapped his hand in the edge of his shirt and turned the knob, throwing open the door to a hallway that was filled with smoke and flame and the roaring of a beast that had no face. He ran, he couldn't help it. The fear was too absolute, too primal, too overwhelming for any rational intervention. He sprinted down the hallway, past the flames that were climbing the walls, past the smoke that was thickening into something almost solid, past the paintings that were blistering and curling in their frames. He reached the stairs and bounded down them 3 at a time, his feet barely touching the steps, his arms windmilling for balance. The kitchen was an inferno. The sitting room was a furnace. The front door was visible through the smoke, a rectangle of light that represented salvation, escape, survival. Ernest ran toward it, his lungs already screaming, his eyes streaming, his skin beginning to blister from the heat. He reached the door. He threw it open. He stumbled out into the night air, gasping, weeping, his body convulsing with coughs that tore at his chest. And then he realized that the air was cold, that there was no fire, that the house behind him was dark and silent and entirely intact. He turned. The door stood open, revealing the hallway beyond, which was empty, unburned, untouched. The smell of smoke was gone, replaced by the smell of autumn leaves and distant rain, and in the garden, standing where the path met the lawn, was the Gallytrot. Its eyes glowed with a satisfaction that was unmistakable. It had almost had him. It had created a scenario so convincing, so viscerally terrifying that he had run without thinking, had bolted from the house in a panic that was exactly what the creature needed. But he had stopped at the door. He hadn't kept running. He hadn't fled into the garden, into the woods, into the open spaces where the Gallytrot could pursue him properly. He had activated the hunt, yes, but he hadn't completed it. The creature was still waiting for the final flight, the desperate sprint that would allow it to close the distance and take what it wanted. Ernest stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his mind reeling from the transition between terror and relief that was so abrupt it felt like whiplash. The Gallytrot watched him. He watched the Gallytrot. And slowly, carefully, with a deliberation that cost him every ounce of will he possessed, he stepped back inside the house and closed the door. The creature did not follow. It couldn't follow, not yet. The rules of the hunt were specific, ancient, unbreakable. It needed him to run. It needed him to create the distance. And as long as he stayed in the house, as long as he refused to flee, the creature was forced to wait. But the waiting was torture. The Gallytrot didn't need to attack physically when it could attack psychologically, wearing down his resistance with a patience that was infinite, that was geological, that was older than human courage. Every night brought a new scenario. The fire was followed by a flood, water rising through the floorboards, cold and black and smelling of deep places, filling the house until Ernest was forced to swim for the stairs. Then an earthquake, the walls shaking, the ceiling cracking, plaster falling in chunks that narrowly missed his head. Then a swarm of wasps, a plague of rats, a ghost in the attic that screamed with his own voice. Each scenario was perfect in its detail, flawless in its execution, designed to trigger the specific fears that Ernest didn't even know he possessed. And each time, Ernest came closer to running. His resistance was eroding, his courage wearing thin, his rationality crumbling under the relentless assault of a creature that knew his mind better than he knew it himself. By the 8th night, he was hallucinating even when awake. He saw the Gallytrot in reflections, in shadows, in the patterns of frost that formed on his bedroom window. He heard its breathing in the walls, its footsteps in the ceiling, its voice in the wind that scratched at the roof tiles like fingernails. He ate without tasting, slept without resting, existed in a state of hypervigilance that was slowly destroying his body and his mind. And on the 9th night, the creature finally made its move. Ernest was in the study, trying to read his uncle's journal by the light of a candle because the electricity had failed, or perhaps because the Gallytrot had caused it to fail, the distinction no longer seeming important. The candle flickered, and in the fluctuating light, the room seemed to change. The walls receded, the ceiling rose, the floor tilted at an angle that suggested the house was sinking, or the world was tilting, or his mind was finally breaking under the strain. And then the door to the study opened. Not the door that led to the hallway. That door was already open, had been open all evening because Ernest was afraid of closed spaces now, afraid of the traps they represented. No, this was a different door. A door that shouldn't have existed, that had no business being in a study that he had measured and mapped and knew intimately. It was a door in the wall behind the desk, a door that led to a space that was not the adjacent bedroom but something else entirely. Through the door, Ernest could see the ruins of the chapel. Not as they were in daylight, weathered walls and overgrown grass and the peaceful decay of centuries, but as they were at night, transformed by moonlight and madness into something that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The walls glowed with a pale luminescence that suggested phosphorescence or perhaps merely the reflection of a moon that was too large, too bright, too close. And in the center of the ruins, where there should have been empty space, was the Gallytrot. It was larger now, much larger. Its blurred edges had expanded until they filled the entire space between the walls, a white static that seemed to crackle and spark with invisible energy. Its eyes were not merely glowing but blazing twin suns that cast red shadows across the stone floor. And its mouth, Ernest saw now that it had a mouth a dark opening in the blur of its face, was open, was waiting, was hungry. "Come," the creature said, and its voice was not a voice but a vibration that resonated in Ernest's bones, in his teeth, in the hollow spaces where his courage had once lived. "Come and finish it. Come and be what you were meant to be." Ernest stood up. He didn't mean to. His body was moving again, drawn toward the door by a force that was not physical but gravitational, a psychic pull that was as irresistible as a black hole's event horizon. He walked around the desk, past the candle that blew out as he passed, through the doorway that should not have existed and into the ruins that were somehow inside his house and outside it simultaneously. The cold hit him like a wall. It was not the cold of an autumn night but something deeper, something that came from the spaces between stars, from the void that existed beyond the edges of the universe. His breath plumed in clouds that froze instantly and fell to the ground like snow, and his skin tightened and cracked with a frostbite that should have taken hours to develop. The Gallytrot waited for him in the center of the ruins. It was no longer merely a creature. It was a phenomenon. Its blurred edges had expanded to fill the entire sky, replacing the stars with a white static that buzzed and crackled and hummed with a frequency that made Ernest's vision blur and his knees buckle. It was the size of a cathedral now, the size of a mountain, the size of a god. And he was walking toward it, one step at a time, his feet moving without his permission, his will overridden by a force that was older than humanity and more absolute than gravity. "No," he whispered, but the word was swallowed by the static, consumed by the white noise, erased by the presence that was rewriting reality around him. "No, I won't. I won't run. I won't." "You don't need to run," the creature said, and its voice was everywhere in the stones, in the air, in the blood that was freezing in Ernest's veins. Running was the old way, the first way, the way of fear and distance and the desperate sprint toward survival. But you have learned something, Ernest Blackwood. You have learned that distance is not safety, that flight is not escape, that the only way out is through. Ernest kept walking. He couldn't stop. His legs moved in a rhythm that was not his own, carrying him toward the creature with a purpose that was as inexorable as a clock's ticking. He was 10 feet away now, then 5, then 3. The Gallytrot's blurred edges were all around him, enveloping him, erasing the world beyond the ruins until there was only white, only static, only the endless humming void. "Walk into me," the creature commanded. "Erase the distance, become the distance, become what you have always been meant to be." Ernest was 1 foot away now. He could see into the creature's mouth, into the darkness that waited beyond the blur, into the space where the stolen breaths were kept, where the souls of the runners waited in an eternity of flight that had no destination. He could see his uncle there, frozen in mid-stride, his face contorted in an expression of terror that would never change. He could see others, dozens of them, hundreds, stretching into a distance that was not distance but merely the absence of arrival. And he understood with a clarity that transcended fear what the Gallytrot was offering. Not death, not consumption, but transformation, translation, the crossing from one state to another, from prey to predator, from runner to hunter, from the one who flees to the one who pursues. "Yes," he whispered, and the word was not surrender but acceptance, not defeat but transcendence. "Yes, I understand now." He stepped forward, into the blur, into the static, into the white. For a moment there was nothing, no sensation, no thought, no existence. He was erased, dissolved, unmade in the space between moments. And then slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, he returned to himself. He was standing in the ruins. The sky was lightening. The static was gone. The Gallytrot was gone. He was alone, and he was alive. Ernest stood in the center of the chapel ruins and felt the dawn touch his face with fingers that were cold but not hostile. He had faced the beast. He had walked into its maw, and he had emerged on the other side, changed but intact, transformed but surviving. He looked at his hands. They were his hands still, with their familiar scars and their scholar's calluses and their frost-reddened skin. He touched his face, felt the stubble on his chin, the cold on his cheeks, the tears that had frozen to his lashes. He was still human, still Ernest Blackwood, still the man who had inherited a haunted house and faced a monster and somehow, impossibly, survived. The peace that filled him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was the peace of the runner who has stopped running, of the frightened man who has discovered that his fear was merely a shadow cast by his own mind. The Gallytrot was gone. The hunt was over. He had conquered his fear by embracing it, had defeated the creature by refusing to flee. He walked back to the house with a lightness in his step that he hadn't felt in years. The garden was beautiful in the dawn light, the dead elms transformed by frost into sculptures of silver and gold. The house itself seemed less oppressive, less haunted, more like a home than a trap. He made tea in the kitchen, his hands steady, his mind clear, and he sat by the window and watched the sun rise over the Suffolk landscape with an appreciation that bordered on the religious. He was free. The creature was gone, and his life, which had been narrowing down to a point of fear and isolation, was suddenly opening up again, expanding outward into possibilities that he had not allowed himself to imagine. After breakfast, he decided to walk to the village. Thorpe Parva was 3 miles away, a distance that had seemed impossibly far during the nights of terror, but that now felt like a pleasant stroll. He needed supplies, needed human contact, needed to reestablish his connection to a world that he had almost allowed himself to leave. He dressed warmly, pulled on his boots, and set out along the lane that wound between hedgerows already touched with the first hints of winter's barrenness. The walk was restorative. The air was crisp, the sky a clear blue that seemed to promise nothing but good things. Ernest found himself humming as he walked, a tune that he didn't recognize, something that might have been a folk song or might have been merely the sound of his own contentment made audible. He passed fields where sheep grazed, their breath steaming in the cold air, their wool thickening against the coming season. He passed cottages where smoke rose from chimneys in straight columns that dissolved into the sky. He passed a stream where the water ran clear over stones that were rounded and smoothed by centuries of patient abrasion. And then he reached the village. Thorpe Parva was smaller than he had expected, a cluster of houses around a green that featured a war memorial and a pub, and a shop that sold everything from bread to batteries. There were people about, a woman walking a dog, a man unloading groceries from a car, a child playing on the green with a stick that might have been a sword or might have been merely a stick. Ernest smiled at them as he passed, feeling a generosity of spirit that was unusual for him, a willingness to connect that had been buried under years of academic rivalry and personal disappointment. The child looked up as Ernest passed, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7, dressed in a coat that was too large for him, his cheeks red with cold and play. He had been chasing a ball, kicking it across the grass with more enthusiasm than skill, and now he stood still, the ball forgotten, his eyes fixed on Ernest with an expression that was not quite fear but was certainly not comfort. Ernest smiled at him. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm, his hand raised in a wave. The boy didn't respond. He stared at Ernest with eyes that were wide and dark and suddenly very serious. His mouth opened slightly as if he were about to speak and then closed again. He took a step backward, then another. Ernest stopped. "What's wrong?" he asked, but the boy was no longer looking at his face. He was looking at something else, something lower, something that Ernest couldn't see without looking down. He looked down. His hands were wrong. They were still his hands. He could see the scars, the calluses, the familiar shape of fingers that had turned thousands of pages and held hundreds of cups of tea. But they were also not his hands. They were blurring at the edges, their outlines vibrating in a way that was sickeningly familiar, that made his stomach clench with a recognition that went beyond memory into the realm of pure instinct. And his skin was white, Not the pale white of a man who has spent too long indoors, but the stark, absolute white of bone, of frost, of the space between stars. It was the white of the Gallytrot, the white of absence, the white of the void. Ernest looked up at the child, and in the boy's eyes he saw his own reflection. And what he saw made him want to scream, to weep, to tear at his own face with fingers that were no longer entirely under his control. His edges were blurring. His skin was whitening. His eyes, he couldn't see his own eyes, but he could feel them changing, feel the heat in them cooling, feel the light in them shifting from warm brown to something else, something colder, something that didn't reflect light but emitted it. He was becoming the Gallytrot. The realization crashed through him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't defeated the creature. He hadn't escaped the hunt. He had simply replaced the hunter. The Gallytrot didn't want to kill him. It wanted to recruit him, to transform him, to make him part of the mechanism that had been operating for centuries, millennia, longer than human memory could track. The creature didn't just guard treasure. It recruited. By walking into its maw, by erasing the distance between himself and the predator, Ernest had not defeated the Gallytrot. He had become it. The old guardian had passed and a new one had risen to take its place. The White Shadow was not a single entity but a succession, a lineage, a role that was passed from host to host whenever someone was desperate enough, brave enough, foolish enough to face the beast directly. Ernest looked at the child again. The boy had retreated to the edge of the green, his face pale, his body trembling. And then, with a sound that was half gasp and half scream, the boy turned and ran. He ran across the green, his small legs pumping, his coat flapping, his feet kicking up clods of turf that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before falling. He ran toward the woman with the dog, toward safety, toward the ordinary world where monsters were stories and white shadows were merely the absence of light. And Ernest watched him run. Something stirred in his chest, something that was not his own, not entirely, but was becoming his own with every passing second. It was hunger, not the hunger of the stomach, but the hunger of the void, the hunger of the space that must be filled. The hunger of the predator that sees prey in flight and feels the ancient, irresistible urge to pursue. He wanted to chase the boy. The desire was so strong, so absolute, so devoid of any moral content that it felt like gravity, like breathing, like the most natural thing in the world. The child was running. The child had created distance, and the distance must be closed. The flight must be ended. The breath must be taken. Ernest took a step forward. His foot landed on the grass, and he felt the earth yield beneath him in a way that was different from before, that suggested his weight was no longer quite what it had been, that his relationship with gravity had been altered in ways he didn't yet understand. He took another step. The boy was halfway across the green now, shouting something to the woman, his voice high and thin with terror. The woman turned, saw Ernest, and her face underwent a transformation that was almost comical in its completeness, from confusion to concern to fear in the space of a single heartbeat. Ernest could smell the boy's fear. He could smell the woman's alarm. He could smell the life that radiated from them, the warmth, the breath, the precious, fragile existence that they took for granted and that he now understood was the most valuable thing in the universe, because it could be taken, because it would be taken, because the Gallytrot existed to take it. He took a third step, and then he stopped. With an effort that felt like it was tearing him in half, like he was fighting against a current that was stronger than any physical force, Ernest forced himself to stand still. He forced his foot to remain on the ground, his body to remain motionless, his will to override the hunger that was screaming at him to run, to chase, to consume. "No," he whispered, and the word was barely audible, barely human, emerging from a throat that was changing, that was becoming something that could produce sounds no human throat could make. "No, I am not. I will not." But even as he spoke, he felt the hunger rise again, stronger than before, overwhelming his resistance like a tide overwhelming a sandcastle. The boy had reached the woman now, was clutching her hand, was being pulled away toward the safety of a nearby cottage. And Ernest stood on the green, his white skin glowing in the morning light, his blurred edges vibrating with a hunger that was older than his humanity, and felt the predatory urge build to a crescendo that made his vision blur and his mind reel. He was the Gallytrot now. He was the White Shadow. He was the hunger that fed on distance and fear. And somewhere, deep beneath the transformation, beneath the static and the void and the ancient predatory instinct that was rewriting his being, a small part of Ernest Blackwood, the part that had loved his mother, that had married Catherine, that had dedicated his life to understanding the world, wept. But the Gallytrot did not weep. The Gallytrot watched the child run, and it waited. It was patient. It was eternal. And it knew with an absolute certainty that transcended human doubt that eventually, inevitably, the prey would stumble. And when it did, the White Shadow would be there, waiting, hungry, patient beyond measure. The woman hurried the boy into the cottage and closed the door. Ernest stood alone on the green, his breath pluming in the cold air, his edges blurring, his eyes beginning to glow with a light that was red and hungry and absolutely, terrifyingly alive. The hunt had not ended, it had merely changed hands. And the new hunter was only just beginning to learn his trade. The days that followed Ernest's transformation were not days in any conventional sense. Time moved differently for him now, flowing not in a straight line but in pulses and stutters, in moments of crystalline clarity interspersed with periods of white static during which he existed as pure sensation without thought. He would find himself standing in the ruins of the chapel with no memory of how he had gotten there, his skin glowing faintly in the darkness, his breath coming in shallow sips that seemed to draw the warmth from the surrounding air. He would find himself in the garden, staring at the house with an intensity that suggested he was trying to remember what the building was for, who had lived there, why it mattered. And he would find himself in the woods, moving through the trees with a silence that was not the silence of stealth, but the silence of absence, of non-presence, of a thing that occupied space without displacing it. The hunger grew with every passing hour. It was not the hunger he had known as a human, the simple, biological need for calories that could be satisfied with bread and meat and wine. This was something else entirely, a hunger that had no name in any human language, a craving that could not be satisfied by any physical substance. It was the hunger of the void, the hunger of the space that must be filled, the hunger of the predator that sees life not as a miracle but as a resource, not as a mystery but as a meal. He tried to fight it. That was the terrible part, the part that would have broken him if he had still been capable of breaking. Some remnant of Ernest Blackwood still existed in the white blur that his body was becoming, some fragment of consciousness that remembered his mother's voice and his wife's laughter, and the satisfaction of turning a page in a book that contained something true. That remnant struggled against the transformation, tried to assert control over limbs that were no longer entirely limbs, tried to remember names that were slipping away like water through fingers that were no longer entirely fingers. But the struggle was hopeless. The Gallytrot was not merely a creature that possessed him. It was a state that he had entered, a condition that he had contracted, a mode of existence that operated according to rules that human will could not override. Every time he tried to resist the hunger grew stronger. Every time he tried to remember his humanity, the memory faded faster. He was becoming the White Shadow not by degrees but by inevitabilities, each moment carrying him further from the person he had been and closer to the thing he was destined to be. The village of Thorpe Parva knew that something had changed. They didn't understand what, how could they? They were farmers and shopkeepers and pensioners who had never encountered anything more supernatural than a particularly vivid dream or a coincidence that seemed too precise to be random. But they felt it. They felt it in the way the temperature dropped at night, in the way their animals grew restless and refused to sleep, in the way their dreams were haunted by images of white shapes that stood at the edges of fields and watched them with eyes that glowed like coals. The deaths resumed. Not many at first. An elderly man who collapsed in his garden, a young woman who suffered a stroke while walking her dog, a child who fell from a tree in an accident that no one could quite explain. Each death was sudden, inexplicable, accompanied by a look of terror on the victim's face that suggested they had seen something in their final moments that could not be named. The local doctor attributed them to natural causes, to coincidence, to the statistical inevitability that in any population, some would die unexpectedly. But the villagers knew. They had seen the White Shadow before. They remembered the stories about Thorpe Morley, about the uncle who had died alone, about the thing that guarded the ruins and fed on the distance created by fear. And now there was a new White Shadow, a new guardian, a new hunger. Ernest became aware of his hunting instincts gradually, like a man becoming aware of a limb he didn't know he possessed. He found himself drawn to movement, to speed, to the particular vibration that accompanied human flight. When a rabbit bolted from its burrow, he felt a surge of something that was not quite excitement but was certainly analogous to it. When a bird took flight from a branch, he felt his attention focus with an intensity that was laser-like, that excluded everything else from his awareness. And when a human being walked past the edge of the estate, he felt the hunger rise in him like a tide, like a wave, like an irresistible force that demanded satisfaction. He learned to control it after a fashion, not to resist it. Resistance was impossible now, but to channel it, to direct it, to choose his moments with a patience that was the only human quality the transformation had not erased. He would wait until nightfall, until the village was asleep, until the only lights were the ones that burned in bedrooms where insomniacs stared at ceilings and tried not to remember their dreams. And then he would move, drifting through the landscape like a cloud, his blurred edges making him invisible to any eye that was not specifically looking for him, his white form blending with the moonlight and the mist until he was indistinguishable from the night itself. He didn't kill them, not directly. That was the horror of the Gallytrot's method, the exquisite cruelty that made it worse than any simple predator. He hunted them. He pursued them. He created the conditions that made them run, and then he followed, folding space around him, appearing in places where he could not possibly be, erasing the distance between himself and his prey with a speed that defied physics. And when their hearts gave out, when their bodies collapsed from exhaustion and terror, he was there to collect what they left behind. The breath, the life, the soul. He felt it now, the collection that his uncle had written about. It was not a physical treasure, not a chest of gold or a hoard of jewels. It was a dimension, a space that existed parallel to the human world, accessible only to those who had become what he had become. In that space, the stolen souls waited, frozen in the moment of their deaths, their faces contorted in expressions of terror that would never change, their bodies forever caught in the act of running from something that could not be escaped. Ernest saw them. In the white static of his transformed consciousness, he saw them clearly. His uncle was there and the others who had preceded him, stretching back through centuries of guardians who had inherited the role and passed it on like a disease, like a curse, like a sacred trust that could not be refused. They were not suffering exactly. They were not at peace either. They were simply waiting, waiting for something that would never arrive, waiting for the chase to end, waiting for the distance to be closed. And Ernest understood with a clarity that transcended his diminishing humanity that this was the true nature of the Gallytrot's existence. It was not a creature but a function, a process, a mechanism that ensured that the fear of death was always present, always active, always hunting. It existed to remind the living that they were prey, that their lives were borrowed, that the distance between themselves and oblivion was measured not in years but in footsteps, in heartbeats, in the moments of panic when they turned and ran. He was the reminder now. He was the fear made flesh. He was the white shadow that children would tell stories about, that adults would dismiss as superstition, that the dying would see in their final moments with eyes that finally understood what they had been running from all along. The boy from the village green haunted him. Not literally. The child was still alive, still running, still breathing with a lungful of air that Ernest had not yet claimed. But the memory of the boy's terror, of the way he had fled from Ernest's transformed visage, of the purity of his fear, it stirred something in the remnants of Ernest's consciousness that was almost like regret, almost like shame, almost like the ghost of a human emotion that had not yet been completely digested by the hunger. He found himself returning to the village green at night, standing in the spot where the boy had stood, watching the cottage where the child slept with a patience that was geological, that was eternal. He wasn't hunting the boy, not specifically. The Gallytrot didn't hunt individuals. It hunted fear itself, and any source of fear would do. But there was something about the child that drew him, something about the memory of that moment on the green that resonated with the fragment of Ernest Blackwood that still existed somewhere in the white blur. Perhaps it was the innocence. The boy had not yet learned to lie, to hide, to construct the elaborate defenses that adults built around their true selves. His fear was pure, unmediated, absolute, and that purity made it appealing, not as a meal but as a memory, as a reminder of what Ernest had lost, what he had given up, what he had sacrificed in his desperate attempt to stand his ground. Because that was the tragedy, the irony, the cruel joke that the universe had played on him. He had stood his ground. He had faced the beast. He had walked into its maw with courage that was genuine, with a will that was absolute. And his reward had been not survival but transformation, not death but something worse than death. He had become the very thing he had faced, the very thing he had refused to flee from, the very thing that had haunted his uncle and his uncle's predecessors back through the centuries. The Gallytrot didn't kill its victims. It recruited them. And in doing so, it ensured that there would always be a hunter, always a guardian, always a white shadow waiting at the edge of the woods for the next runner, the next frightened soul, the next desperate flight toward an escape that did not exist. One night, a month after his transformation, Ernest found himself at the ruins of the chapel. He didn't remember walking there. He was simply there, as if the space between his previous location and this one had been folded and compressed until it no longer existed. The ruins were different at night, transformed by moonlight into something that was almost beautiful, almost sacred. The limestone walls glowed with a pale luminescence that suggested phosphorescence, or perhaps merely the reflection of a moon that was too full, too bright, too present. And on the walls, the carvings were visible. Not merely visible but active, their surfaces shifting and moving in patterns that suggested meaning without delivering it. Ernest traced them with fingers that were no longer entirely fingers, feeling the texture of the ancient stone, and understood that they were not merely decorations but instructions. A manual for the Gallytrot, written in a language that was older than English, older than Latin, older than any human tongue. They described the hunt. They described the transformation. They described the endless cycle of recruitment and replacement that ensured the guardian would never die. And in the center of the largest carving, where the spiral tightened inward toward its dark point, there was a figure, a human figure, or had been once, standing with its arms outstretched and its head thrown back in an attitude that might have been ecstasy or might have been agony. The figure's edges were blurred, its features indistinct, but Ernest recognized it anyway. It was him. It was the Gallytrot. It was every guardian who had ever stood in these ruins and felt the hunger rise like a tide. He pressed his hand against the carving, and the stone was warm. Warm and vibrating with a frequency that matched the static in his mind, that resonated in the hollow spaces where his humanity had once lived. And for a moment, just a moment, he felt something that might have been peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of acceptance, but the peace of surrender. The peace that comes from understanding that the struggle is over, that the transformation is complete, that the person he had been was gone and would not be returning. Ernest Blackwood was dead, had been dead since the moment he walked into the white blur in the center of the ruins. What remained was the Gallytrot, the guardian, the hunger, the white shadow that would stand at the edge of the woods and watch and wait and hunt until the next desperate soul came along, faced the beast, and took his place. He turned away from the carving and looked out at the estate. The house was visible in the distance, its windows dark, its roof sagging, its walls crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. It would stand for a while longer, perhaps years, perhaps decades, until the elements reclaimed it and the estate returned to the wild. And then someone else would come, a distant relative, a curious historian, a desperate soul looking for escape from a world that had turned against them. They would find the ruins, they would see the white shadow, and they would face the same choice that Ernest had faced. Stand your ground and it cannot touch you. Show it your heels and you have already written your own epitaph. But the choice was a lie. Ernest understood that now. Standing your ground didn't save you. It merely changed the nature of your defeat. Running didn't doom you. It merely accelerated the inevitable. The only true escape was to never encounter the Gallytrot at all, to live your life in ignorance of the white shadow and the hunger it represented, to die in your bed with your family around you and your fears unmanifested. But that was not the fate of those who came to Thorpe Morley. That was not the fate of the curious, the desperate, the lonely. They came seeking answers, seeking escape, seeking the truth that they believed would set them free. And they found the Gallytrot instead. They found the guardian. They found the hunger. And one by one, generation by generation, they replaced it. They became it. They passed the torch of terror from hand to blurring hand, ensuring that the white shadow would never die, that the hunt would never end, that the distance created by fear would always be there to be consumed. Ernest moved away from the ruins, his blurred form drifting across the landscape like a ghost, like a cloud, like a memory of something that had never truly existed. He felt the night around him, felt the lives that slept in the village beyond the woods, felt the warmth and the breath and the precious, fragile existence that he was destined to harvest. The hunger was endless. The hunger was beautiful. And Ernest Blackwood, the new Gallytrot of Thorpe Morley, was finally ready to feed it. In the distance, a dog barked. A child cried out in its sleep. A mother rose from her bed to comfort it, unaware that something white and hungry was watching from the edge of the woods, waiting for the moment when distance would be created, when fear would take flight, when the chase would begin again. The white shadow did not sleep. The white shadow did not rest. The white shadow merely waited, patient beyond measure, for the next runner to appear. And when they did, when they always did, the Gallytrot would be there, ready, hungry, eternal. Spring came to Thorpe Morley with a reluctance that seemed almost deliberate, as if the season itself were hesitating to bring warmth and growth to a place that had grown accustomed to cold and decay. The frost lingered in the shaded corners of the estate long after the surrounding countryside had turned green, and the mist that rose from the ground at dawn had a quality that was thicker, more substantial, more alive than mere meteorological phenomenon. The villagers of Thorpe Parva had learned to adapt. They spoke of the estate in whispers, crossed themselves when passing its gates, and kept their children indoors after dark with a strictness that suggested knowledge rather than mere superstition. The deaths had continued through the winter, not many, but enough to establish a pattern, enough to remind them that the white shadow was not a story but a presence, not a legend but a law. And in the spring, when the nights grew shorter and the light grew stronger, they allowed themselves a cautious hope that perhaps the guardian had slept, that perhaps the cycle had broken, that perhaps the new owner of Thorpe Morley had found a way to do what no previous owner had managed. They were wrong, of course. The Gallytrot did not sleep. It merely waited, patient as stone, for the conditions that would activate the hunt, and those conditions were not seasonal. They were psychological. They arose from fear, from flight, from the desperate human need to be elsewhere that the creature had been designed to exploit. Ernest had lost most of his memories by spring. The details of his former life, his teaching position, his failed marriage, his academic ambitions, had faded into a white blur that was indistinguishable from the static that now constituted his consciousness. He retained only fragments: the smell of old books, the taste of whiskey, the feeling of a pen in his hand. These memories surfaced occasionally, like debris rising from a deep lake, and then sank again into the depths of the hunger that consumed them. But he retained one thing that surprised him, one thing that the transformation had not erased, that the hunger had not digested, that the white static had not overwritten. It was the memory of the boy on the green, the child who had looked at him with eyes that were wide and dark and suddenly very serious, the child who had run. That memory remained clear and sharp, a single point of light in the darkness of his transformed mind. He didn't know why. Perhaps because the boy's fear had been pure, unmediated by adult complexity. Perhaps because the child represented something that Ernest had lost and could never recover. Or perhaps because the Gallytrot, in its ancient wisdom, understood that the most potent fears were those associated with innocence, and kept the memory alive as a kind of fuel, a kind of sustenance, a kind of proof that the hunger was justified. He found himself returning to the village green at night, standing in the shadows of the elms that bordered the parish church, watching the houses where families slept with a patience that was geological, that was eternal. He wasn't hunting them, not specifically. The Gallytrot didn't hunt by choice. It hunted by necessity, activated by the flight of its prey rather than by any predatory intention. But he watched them nonetheless, drawn to the warmth and the life and the fragile, precious existence that they took for granted. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and the air was still, he would see a light in an upstairs window. A child, unable to sleep, sitting up in bed with a book or a toy, staring out at the darkness with eyes that were not yet afraid. And in those moments, Ernest felt something that might have been longing, something that might have been regret, something that might have been the ghost of a love that had not yet been completely consumed by the hunger. He knew that he would outlast them. That was the nature of his existence now. He would outlast the villagers, outlast their children, outlast their children's children. He would stand at the edge of the woods while generations rose and fell, while houses were built and abandoned, while the world changed around him in ways that he could not comprehend and did not need to. He was the Gallytrot. He was the guardian. He was the white shadow that watched and waited and hunted. And someday, when the last of the villagers had died and the estate had returned to wilderness, and the ruins of the chapel had crumbled to dust, someone new would come. A curious traveler, a lost hiker, a historian seeking answers in a landscape that had forgotten its own history. They would see the white shadow at the edge of the woods. They would feel the hunger that radiated from it, and they would face the same choice that Ernest had faced, that his uncle had faced, that every guardian had faced since the first stone was laid in the chapel foundations. Stand your ground and it cannot touch you. Show it your heels and you have already written your own epitaph. But Ernest knew the truth now. He knew that the choice was a lie, that the courage was a trap, that the transformation was inevitable for anyone who encountered the Gallytrot and survived long enough to understand what it was. The only true escape was ignorance. The only true safety was distance. And the only true peace was the peace of never having seen the white shadow at all. He stood in the darkness beneath the elms, his blurred edges vibrating with a hunger that was older than his humanity and would outlast whatever remained of it. And he waited. He would always wait. That was his nature now, his function, his purpose. The Gallytrot did not sleep. The Gallytrot did not rest. The Gallytrot merely watched, patient beyond measure, for the next runner to appear. And when they did, when they always did, the white shadow would be there, ready, hungry, eternal. The hunt never ended. It only waited for the next chapter to begin. The Starvation Pit. The snow had stopped falling 3 hours ago, but the silence it left behind was the kind that swallowed sound whole, a dense and suffocating absence that made Officer Marvin Hale's own breathing feel like a trespass. He stood at the edge of a small clearing in the northern woods, his boots sinking into drifts that came up to his knees, his breath pluming out in thin white ghosts that vanished almost as quickly as they formed. He had been a search and rescue officer for 19 years, had pulled hypothermic hikers from frozen ravines, and found children who had wandered off marked trails in the middle of blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing. He had seen death in every configuration that the wilderness could offer: the peaceful, blue-lipped sleep of exposure, the violent, claw-marked remains of bare encounters, the inexplicable vanishings that left behind only a single boot or a half-empty thermos. But he had never seen anything like what waited for him in the center of that clearing. Scott Anders sat perfectly still on a fallen log that had been stripped of its bark by wind and time, his posture so rigid and exact that he might have been carved from the same pale wood. He was naked from the waist up despite the sub-zero temperatures, his skin mottled with the livid purple and angry red of advanced frostbite. His chest rose and fell in shallow, barely perceptible movements, and his eyes were open and staring, but they were not looking at Hale. They were fixed on something in the middle distance, something that only Scott could see, and in their glassy, unfocused depths there was no fear, no pain, no recognition of the officer who had spent the last 48 hours fighting through waist-deep snow to find him. There was only a terrible, childlike patience, the kind of waiting that went beyond hope into something that resembled worship. Hale took a step forward, his boots crunching through the crust of ice that had formed over the snow, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the vacuum of the forest. "Scott Anders," he called out, his voice hoarse from the cold and from shouting until his throat had gone raw over the past 2 days. "My name is Officer Hale. I'm here to bring you out." Scott did not blink. He did not turn his head. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, and it was only when Hale took another step closer, close enough to see the details that the falling snow had tried to obscure, that the officer felt his first true lurch of vertigo. The hands in Scott's lap were wrong. They were too small, too neat, and the fingers. There were only 6 fingers total, 3 on each hand, the stumps wrapped in strips of what looked like pale, waterlogged birch bark. Hale's eyes traveled downward, following the trail of dark blood that had frozen in a black river down Scott's thighs and onto the log. And there, piled between his bare feet like a cairn marking some profane pilgrimage, was a small, neatly stacked pile of severed fingers. All 10 of them. The nails were ragged where they had been torn or bitten away, and the pale flesh at the base of each digit had the bruised, pulpy appearance of flesh that had been gnawed rather than cut. Hale's radio crackled against his shoulder, the voice of his partner distorted by static and distance. "Marv, you copy? You find anything?" Hale didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His mouth had gone dry, and his heart was hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that seemed too fast, too desperate for the stillness of the scene before him. He reached for his sidearm without thinking, his gloved hand closing around the grip, though he couldn't have said what threat he intended to fire upon. There was nothing in the clearing but Scott, the snow, and the trees that leaned inward like spectators at an execution. Scott's lips parted. His voice, when it came, was high and clear and entirely devoid of the guttural damage Hale would have expected from a man who had been exposed to the elements for days. It was a child's voice, or the memory of one, singing a tune that Hale almost recognized, a lullaby, something about mockingbirds and diamond rings, sung with a patience that made the officer's skin tighten until he felt it might split across his cheekbones. "It's almost here," Scott said between verses. "Can you hear it? It's just about to arrive." "What is?" Hale managed to ask, though the question felt stupid and small in the face of what he was witnessing. "What's coming, Scott?" Scott smiled then, and the expression was so genuine, so beatific, that it was worse than any scream could have been. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and when he smiled they split further, painting his teeth in a shade of red that seemed too bright against the monochrome white of the clearing. "The hunger," he whispered. The beautiful hunger, and I'm going to feed it." Hale never got to ask what Scott intended to feed it. The smile widened, and Scott's remaining fingers, the three on his right hand, reached down to the pile of severed digits at his feet. He selected one, turning it over with the tenderness of a man examining a rare coin, and then, without hesitation, he placed it in his mouth and began to chew. The sound was wet and rhythmic, a gentle mastication that seemed to please him enormously, and as he chewed he resumed his lullaby, his eyes never leaving that middle distance where something Hale could not see was apparently drawing closer with every passing second. Hale vomited into the snow. He couldn't help it. The bile burned his throat and steamed in the frozen air, and when he looked up again, wiping his mouth with the back of his glove, he saw that Scott had stopped singing. He was staring at Hale now, really staring, with an intensity that made the officer take a step backward. "You shouldn't have come," Scott said, and his voice was different now. It was layered, as if two people were speaking in imperfect unison, one high and one impossibly low, a subsonic rumble that Hale felt in his sternum rather than heard with his ears. "The hunger knows you're here now, and it's already so very empty." That was when the smell hit him. It rolled across the clearing in a wave so sudden and so foul that Hale's eyes watered and his knees buckled. It was the smell of meat left in the sun for weeks, of opened bellies and ruptured intestines, of infection and decay and something else beneath it, something clean and sharp and ancient, like ozone or the air before a lightning strike. It was the smell of starvation made physical, of a void so absolute that it consumed the very concept of satisfaction. Hale gagged, his hand tightening on his weapon, and as he stumbled backward another step, he saw movement at the tree line. It was tall. That was all Hale could process before his mind began to reject the image. It was taller than any man, taller than any animal, its limbs stretched to lengths that violated the proportions of any known skeleton. It moved behind the screen of pines with a gait that was both jerking and fluid, stuttering forward in bursts of impossible speed, and then freezing in place, cocking a head that sat too low between shoulders that jutted like broken roof beams. Hale couldn't see it clearly. The trees obscured too much, and his vision was blurred by tears and terror, but he saw enough. He saw the emaciated torso, the ribs like cage bars pressing against parchment skin. He saw the arms that hung to the thing's knees, ending in claws that looked more like antlers than fingers. And he saw the face, if it could be called a face, a stretched, lipless grin of yellow teeth that extended far beyond the bounds of any human jaw, locked in an expression of permanent, ravenous ecstasy. It wasn't looking at Scott. It was looking at Hale. And Hale, for all his training, for all his years of facing down the worst that the wilderness could conjure, did the only thing his body would allow him to do. He ran. He ran through snow that seemed to clutch at his ankles, ran past trees that leaned together to block his path, ran until his lungs were burning and his throat was raw, and the scream he had been trying to voice came out as nothing more than a whistling wheeze. He ran without direction, without thought, driven by a primal imperative older than language. Behind him, he heard Scott begin to laugh, a high, delighted sound that was almost lost beneath a deeper noise, a cracking and snapping like trees being uprooted, like bones being pulled from their sockets. Hale didn't look back. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that if he looked back he would see something that would stop his heart in his chest. He ran for what felt like hours, though his watch told him it was only minutes. The forest opened around him and closed again, the trees seeming to shift in his peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations every time he blinked. He saw the same fallen trunk 3 times, the same jagged rock formation that looked like a crouching wolf, the same forked birch tree with bark peeled away in strips that formed patterns almost like letters. He was running in circles. He was running in something worse than circles. When he finally collapsed, his legs gave out beneath him and he pitched forward into a snowbank that cushioned his fall like a feather mattress. He lay there, gasping, his face pressed into the cold, and listened. For a moment there was nothing but the wind and his own heartbeat, thunderous in his ears. Then from somewhere behind him, impossibly close, impossibly far, came the sound of humming. A lullaby, mockingbird, diamond ring. And beneath it, carried on a wind that smelled of carrion and cold starlight, the wet, rhythmic sound of chewing. Hale didn't make it out of the woods that day. When the second search team found him 48 hours later, he was sitting upright in a snowdrift, his back against a granite outcropping, his eyes open and staring. His sidearm was still clutched in his frozen hand, all 15 rounds fired into the empty air above him. He was alive, technically, though the paramedics would later say they had never seen a man so close to death who still maintained vital signs. When they loaded him onto the stretcher, he began to scream, a continuous, unbroken wail that didn't stop until they sedated him 3 miles from the clearing. He screamed for 6 days straight, and when his voice finally gave out, he wrote on a notepad in a hand so shaky it was barely legible, "Don't go back for Scott. Scott is feeding it. Scott is feeding all of us to it." But they did go back for Scott. Of course they did. They were professionals, and Scott Anders was a missing person, a victim, a man who needed rescue. They found the clearing easily enough. Hale's tracks led them straight to it, though the tracks seemed to double back on themselves in ways that the forensic team would later describe as geometrically impossible. They found the log where Scott had been sitting. They found the blood, frozen in black ribbons across the snow. They found the birch bark strips, soaked with something that was neither blood nor sap but some viscous intermediary that defied analysis. But they did not find Scott Anders. They did not find the pile of fingers. And they did not find whatever it was that Scott had been waiting for, though one of the younger officers, a woman named Deborah Chen, who had only been with the department for 8 months, reported that she heard humming coming from the tree line, a faint and tuneless sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The official report called it a bear attack. The unofficial reports, whispered over beers in the bars of the nearby town of Blackwood, called it something else entirely. But no one who went back into those woods after Scott Anders ever came out quite the same, and no one who heard Deborah Chen describe that humming ever slept quite as soundly again. It began, as these things often do, with hunger. Not the dramatic hunger of starvation, but the subtle, nagging hunger of the modern world. The hunger for more, for better, for faster, for thinner, for stronger, for something that would finally fill the hole that 3 meals a day and a comfortable retirement could not seem to patch. Scott Anders had built his entire career on that hunger. As a nutritionist to the elite, a guru of the body optimization movement, he had promised his clients transcendence through deprivation. He had designed fasting protocols that pushed the human body to the brink of collapse and then held it there, suspended in a state of ketosis so deep that his clients reported visions, hallucinations, a sense of floating above their own physical forms. He called it biological transcendence. The medical board called it gross negligence. The families of the 3 athletes who had collapsed during his extreme protocols called it manslaughter. The scandal had been enough to strip him of his license, his reputation, and his marriage, though his wife had been looking for an excuse to leave for years. It had been enough to make him a pariah in the circles that had once clamored for his consultations, enough to reduce his TED Talk viewership from millions to a trickle of morbid curiosity seekers who wanted to watch the train wreck in high definition. But it had not been enough to destroy his belief. If anything, the scandal had only sharpened his conviction. The world wasn't ready for what he had discovered. The world was too soft, too attached to its comforts, too afraid of the necessary pain that preceded true evolution. Scott had not been wrong. He had simply been ahead of his time, and time, he believed, would eventually prove him right. That was why, when the letter arrived in a plain brown envelope with no return address, he had opened it with a sense of destiny rather than suspicion. The letter was from a man named Gregory Vance, a former colleague who had worked with Scott during the early days of his research, before the fame and the fortune and the fall. Vance had been there when Scott first hypothesized that the human body could be trained to reject the need for sustenance entirely, that the digestive system was an evolutionary throwback that modern science could finally outgrow. Vance had been a believer once, before the lawsuits and the subpoenas had sent him running for the safety of a tenure-track position at a second-tier university. But the letter suggested that Vance's faith had been renewed and that he was not alone. "The cabin is real," Vance had written. "The isolation is total. The subjects are ready. We have 3 volunteers who have reached the necessary psychological threshold, all former athletes, all familiar with your methods, all willing to push past the boundaries that society has placed on human potential. We need you, Scott. Not as a leader, but as a witness. We need someone who understands what we're trying to achieve, someone who won't flinch when the body begins to reveal its true capabilities. Come to the northern woods. Come to the place where the trees grow so thick that the sun only touches the ground for 3 hours a day. Come and see what hunger can really do." Scott had sold his car to buy the supplies, had emptied his savings to purchase cold-weather gear that would have been the envy of any Arctic expedition. He had told no one where he was going, had left no forwarding address, had simply walked away from his apartment in the city with a single duffel bag and the burning certainty that this was the moment his life had been building toward. The bus dropped him at a crossroads 50 miles from the nearest town, and from there he had hiked for 2 days through terrain that grew progressively wilder, progressively less forgiving, until the trail markers disappeared entirely and he was navigating by compass, and the slowly dawning realization that Vance had chosen this location not despite its hostility, but because of it. The cabin sat in a valley between 2 ridges of granite that rose like the vertebrae of some enormous fossilized spine. It was larger than Scott had expected, a main structure of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney, supplemented by 2 smaller outbuildings that looked like they had been added in different decades. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin gray thread that dissolved into the overcast sky, and as Scott approached across the frozen meadow that served as the property's front yard, he saw figures moving behind the frost-rimed windows. 3 figures, just as Vance had promised. The door opened before he could knock, and Gregory Vance stood in the frame, thinner than Scott remembered, his face weathered by wind and what looked like sleeplessness, but his eyes bright with an enthusiasm that bordered on the religious. "Scott," he said, and his voice was hushed, reverent. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." "You knew I would," Scott said, stepping across the threshold into warmth that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something else, something metallic and sharp that he couldn't identify. "You wouldn't have written otherwise." Vance smiled, and the expression was so genuine, so devoid of the guardedness that had characterized their final interactions, that Scott felt a flicker of unease beneath his excitement. "The others are inside," Vance said, gesturing toward the main room where a fire crackled in the stone hearth. "They're eager to meet you. We've been preparing for this for 6 months, Scott. 6 months of baseline fasting, of meditation, of sensory deprivation. We're ready to begin the final phase. We're ready to stop needing food entirely." The others were exactly what Scott had expected, and somehow worse. There was Marcus Webb, a marathon runner who had been banned from competition after testing positive for a blood-thinning agent that Scott had recommended. Marcus had the hollow-cheeked, feverish look of a man who had been running on nothing but adrenaline and conviction for too long, and when he shook Scott's hand, his grip was cold and trembling. There was Diana Crowley, a former gymnast who had been one of Scott's most promising proteges until a dislocated shoulder and a subsequent opioid addiction had derailed her career. She sat by the fire with her knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in a wool blanket that did not seem to be warming her, and her eyes followed Scott around the room with an intensity that made him think of predators calculating distance. And there was Elias Thorne, the youngest of the group, a biathlon champion who had never actually been involved in the scandal but who had read Scott's suppressed research papers online and become obsessed with the idea of human optimization beyond the caloric model. Elias was the only one who looked healthy, which somehow made him the most disturbing of the three. He smiled too readily, moved too smoothly, and when he spoke of the experiment his voice had the cadence of a true believer reciting scripture. "We've already begun the pre-fast preparation," Elias explained as Vance poured Scott a mug of herbal tea that smelled of pine needles and something bitter. 3 days of complete isolation from external stimuli, no books, no music, no conversation, just the body and its own resources. It's remarkable how quickly the mind begins to sharpen when it's not constantly processing sensory input. I can hear my own heartbeat, Mr. Anders. I can feel the blood moving through my veins. It's like the body is finally speaking in a language I've spent my whole life learning to understand. Scott sipped the tea. It was bitter, almost caustic, but he drank it anyway, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "And the goal?" he asked, looking at each of them in turn. "The goal is still the same, true biological transcendence, freedom from the tyranny of the digestive system." "Freedom from need," Vance corrected, his voice soft but firm. "That's what we're really after, Scott. Not just freedom from food, but freedom from the entire architecture of wanting. Think about it. Every moment of human suffering can be traced back to some form of hunger. Hunger for food, hunger for love, hunger for status, hunger for meaning. What if we could strip all of that away? What if we could reach a state of pure existence, unburdened by the body's constant demands? That's what the original inhabitants of this land understood. That's what we're here to remember." "The original inhabitants?" Scott asked, setting down his mug. "You mean indigenous fasting practices? I've studied those, Gregory. Most of them were seasonal, tied to religious ceremonies, not—" "Not what?" Vance interrupted, and there was an edge to his voice now, a sharpness that hadn't been there moments before. "Not scientific enough, not rigorous enough for your standards. I'm not talking about your appropriated wellness blog version of shamanism, Scott. I'm talking about something older. Something that was here before the first humans arrived. This land has a history of hunger that goes back 10,000 years. The glaciers scraped this valley clean, left nothing but rock and ice, and the things that learned to survive here did so by learning to want less, by learning to need nothing, by becoming the hunger itself." The fire popped, sending a constellation of sparks up the chimney, and in the sudden flare of light Scott saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow that detached itself from the deeper darkness and slid along the wall before vanishing into the ceiling beams. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, and when he looked again there was nothing there but the play of firelight on rough-hewn wood. "You're tired," Diana said, her voice flat and affectless. "You've been walking for 2 days. You should rest. Tomorrow we can show you the pit." "The pit?" Scott asked. "The Starvation Pit," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the word, a dry sound like paper tearing. "It's where it all started, where it all starts every time." Scott wanted to ask what he meant, but the tea was making his eyelids heavy, and the warmth of the fire was pulling him down into a drowsiness that felt less like relaxation and more like surrender. He let Vance guide him to a cot in the corner of the room, let them cover him with a blanket that smelled of cedar and dust. And as he drifted towards sleep, he thought he heard them talking in whispers, their voices overlapping in a rhythm that sounded almost like chanting. He thought he heard the word feast, and the word offering, and something else, something that might have been a name or might have been merely a sound, a long vowel drawn out, until it became indistinguishable from the wind that scratched at the cabin's log walls like fingernails seeking purchase. He slept without dreaming, or if he dreamed, he did not remember. When he woke, the fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was empty except for Diana, who sat by the window watching the dawn light creep across the snow. She did not turn when he sat up, did not acknowledge his presence in any way, and when he asked where the others had gone, she answered without looking at him, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "They went to prepare the perimeter, to mark the boundaries. It has to know where we are, Scott. It has to be able to find us when we're ready." "When we're ready for what?" Scott asked. But Diana only shook her head and pressed her palm against the frosted glass, and in the pink light of the Arctic dawn her skin looked so thin, so translucent, that he could almost see the bones beneath it, the fragile architecture of mortality that his entire career had been dedicated to outsmarting. "When we're ready to be empty," she whispered, "truly, finally empty." The day passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation that felt less like scientific rigor and more like cultic ritual. Vance had mapped out a precise schedule, 7 days of gradual caloric reduction, followed by a complete fast that would last for 20 days. During the fasting period, they would engage in what he called environmental immersion, walking the property perimeter, meditating in the snow, sleeping in shifts so that someone was always awake to maintain the vigil. When Scott asked what they were supposed to be watching for, Vance had only smiled that too bright smile and said, "You'll know it when you feel it. The hunger has a gravity. It pulls at you. And when you've emptied yourself enough, you'll feel it pulling, and you'll know that you're ready to let it in." Scott had spent years designing deprivation protocols, had pushed human bodies to the edge of endurance and beyond. But there was something about Vance's methodology that disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate. It was the casualness with which Vance spoke about permanent damage, the gleam in his eye when he described the hallucinations that would begin around day 10 of the fast, the way he seemed to welcome the psychological breakdown that Scott had always treated as a dangerous side effect to be managed and mitigated. This wasn't science. This was something older, something that wore the language of biology like a skin suit over bones of an entirely different shape. But Scott stayed. He stayed because he had nowhere else to go, because the scandal had burned every bridge that might have led back to a normal life, because some part of him, the part that had always whispered in the dark hours of the night that he was right, that the world was wrong, that transcendence required sacrifice, wanted to believe that Vance had found something real, something true, something that would vindicate all the years of work and all the lives he had damaged in pursuit of his vision. On the third day, they showed him the Starvation Pit. It was located on the eastern edge of the property, in a stand of birch trees that grew so close together their white trunks looked like the bars of a cage. The ground there was different from the rest of the meadow, softer, darker, as if the soil had been turned over recently and then frozen in place. And in the center of the clearing, visible only because the snow had been brushed away from its edges, was a shallow depression no more than 6 feet across and perhaps 2 feet deep. It was lined with stones that were black with age and moisture, stones that had been placed with deliberate care to form a rough circle. Pieces of birch bark, peeled from the surrounding trees and dried to the consistency of parchment, had been arranged around the rim in patterns that looked almost like writing, but resolved into nothing recognizable when Scott leaned closer to examine them. "This is where they buried the ones who didn't make it," Vance said, his voice hushed with something that might have been reverence or might have been fear. "The original inhabitants, the ones who tried to reach the state of pure hunger and couldn't. They weren't failures, Scott. They were offerings. The land remembers them. The land remembers the hunger that consumed them. And when we perform the ritual here, when we empty ourselves in this spot, we're joining our hunger to theirs. We're making ourselves part of something that's been growing for 10,000 years." "This is a grave," Scott said, stepping back from the pit's edge. "Gregory, this is a burial site. You can't just—" "Can't just what?" Vance's voice was still soft, but there was steel beneath it now. "Can't just respect the dead. That's exactly what we're doing, Scott. We're respecting them by continuing their work, by finishing what they started. They died trying to reach a state of perfect emptiness, trying to become vessels for something that could fill the void inside them. We're going to succeed where they failed. We're going to empty ourselves so completely that the hunger itself will have no choice but to enter us, to make us its home." Marcus and Elias were already kneeling at the edge of the pit, their heads bowed, their lips moving in silent recitation. Diana stood apart from them, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on something in the tree line that Scott couldn't see. The air here was different, colder somehow, despite the sunlight that filtered through the birch canopy in pale shafts. The silence was deeper, more absolute, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" Scott asked, and he was proud of how steady his voice sounded, how rational. "You think some spirit is going to enter us because we stop eating? Gregory, I've studied the physiology of fasting. I know what happens to the body during extended deprivation. Hallucinations, cognitive dysfunction, metabolic collapse. Whatever you think you're calling, it's not a spirit. It's your own brain starving for glucose." Vance turned to look at him, and in the dappled light his eyes seemed to change color, shifting from brown to something darker, something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "Is that what you think?" he asked. "Is that what you really believe after everything you've seen? After the visions your athletes reported, after the descriptions of presences and entities that your protocols consistently produced, you thought those were just hallucinations, Scott? Just misfiring neurons. But what if they weren't? What if the brain, when deprived of its usual inputs, opens itself to inputs that have always been there, always been waiting, but that our full bellies and our busy lives have drowned out? What if starvation isn't a path to death, but a door?" Scott opened his mouth to argue, to explain the well-documented mechanisms by which hypoglycemia produced altered states of consciousness, but before he could speak the wind shifted. It came from the north, from the direction of the deeper woods, and it carried a smell that stopped the words in his throat. It was the smell he would later encounter in the clearing, the smell of opened graves and infected wounds and something else, something ancient and clean and terrible. It was the smell of hunger made manifest, of a void so absolute that it pulled at the air itself, creating a pressure differential that made his ears pop and his sinuses ache. Marcus looked up from his prayers, his face pale and shining with a mixture of terror and ecstasy. "It knows we're here," he whispered. "It can smell the emptiness. It can smell what we're trying to become." "Smells like a dead animal," Scott said, but his voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to himself. "Probably a moose that got caught in the freeze. We should mark the location and—" "No." Elias stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if he were a marionette being operated by strings that were too short. "No, it's not a moose. It's not anything that has a name in your books, Mr. Anders. It's the hunger. It's always been the hunger. And it's been waiting so long. It's been sleeping under the ice and the snow, waiting for someone to remember how to call it." The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, leaving behind a silence that felt preternatural, anticipatory. And in that silence, Scott heard something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. It was a sound from very far away, carried across the frozen landscape by acoustics that shouldn't have been possible. It was the sound of something walking, no, not walking, moving, through the deep woods to the north. Heavy footsteps, impossibly heavy, each one accompanied by a cracking sound like branches breaking under enormous weight. But the rhythm was wrong. The footsteps came in pairs, but the interval between pairs was too long, as if whatever was making them was taking strides of 15 or 20 feet. And beneath the footsteps, barely audible, was another sound. A wet, rhythmic dragging, like a tarp being pulled across wet pavement, or like something with too many limbs moving in a gait that no terrestrial anatomy could replicate. "We should go back to the cabin," Scott said, and his voice was higher than he intended, tight with a fear he hadn't expected to feel. "Now, we should go back now." "We can't," Diana said, and her voice was dreamy, detached, as if she were speaking from very far away. "We started the ritual, Scott. We marked the boundaries. We opened the door. If we run now, it will just follow us. It will follow us anywhere we go because it knows our scent now. It knows what we smell like when we're empty." The footsteps had stopped. The dragging sound had stopped. In the absolute stillness that followed, Scott became aware of a new sensation, a pressure against his mind, a kind of psychic gravity that seemed to be pulling at his thoughts, his memories, his sense of self. It was subtle at first, no stronger than the urge to look over one's shoulder in a dark room, but it grew with every passing second, intensifying into something that felt almost physical, almost like hands reaching into his skull and sifting through the contents. "What is that?" he gasped, pressing his palms against his temples. "What is it doing?" "It's looking," Vance said, and there were tears in his eyes, tears of joy or terror or some inextricable mixture of both. "It's looking inside us to see if we're empty enough, to see if we're ready to receive it." Scott wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn and flee, to sprint back to the cabin and lock the door and barricade the windows and wait for the snowmobile he had arranged to pick him up in 3 weeks. But his legs wouldn't move. The pressure in his mind had crystallized into something like paralysis, a freezing of will as complete as the freezing of the landscape around him. He stood at the edge of the starvation pit, unable to move, unable to look away, and felt something vast and ancient and absolutely ravenous turn its attention upon him like a searchlight sweeping across a darkened field. It found him wanting. He knew that instantly, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely. It found him too full, too cluttered with ego and ambition and the stubborn belief that he understood the world. It found him unready, and in its disappointment there was a kind of hunger that made his stomach clench and his mouth flood with saliva, a reflexive preparation for food that he knew, with sickening certainty, would never arrive. The moment passed. The pressure lifted, sudden as a released breath, and Scott staggered backward, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. The others were looking at him with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt to something that might have been hunger itself, mirrored and magnified. "Not yet," Vance said softly, "but soon. We have 20 days, Scott, 20 days to empty ourselves completely. And when we do, when we've scraped away every last trace of the men we used to be, it will come for us, and we will welcome it." They walked back to the cabin in a silence that was broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot and the distant, intermittent sound of something heavy moving through the woods to the north. Scott told himself it was a moose, or a bear, or a falling tree. He told himself that the pressure in his mind had been hypoglycemia, or altitude sickness, or the first symptoms of a stroke. He told himself these things with the desperate fervor of a man trying to outshout a voice that was growing louder with every step. But he didn't believe any of it. Not really. Because beneath the fear, beneath the revulsion, beneath the clinical analysis that his training demanded, there was something else. Something that responded to the presence in the woods with a recognition that went deeper than memory, deeper than instinct. Something that had been waiting, just as the thing in the woods had been waiting, for a door to open. And now, standing in the snow with his breath steaming and his hands trembling, and his stomach already beginning to growl with the first pangs of the deprivation to come, Scott Anders felt that door begin to swing inward. The first 7 days passed in a haze of diminishing returns and mounting dread. Vance had structured the deprivation with a precision that would have impressed Scott in his former life, a gradual tapering of caloric intake that began at 800 calories per day and descended by increments of 100 until, by the end of the first week, they were consuming nothing but water and a bitter tea brewed from herbs that Vance refused to identify. "They help with the clarity," was all he would say, his eyes bright and unfocused, his hands constantly in motion, fidgeting, counting, tracing invisible patterns on the wooden table. "They open the pathways. They make you receptive." Scott didn't feel receptive. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean, a vessel that had been emptied and then left to rattle in the wind. The hunger that began as a mild discomfort on day 3 had become a constant, grinding presence by day 5, a fist clenched in his abdomen that tightened with every passing hour. He found himself obsessing over food in ways that would have embarrassed him in his previous life, not gourmet meals or elaborate preparations, but the most basic, primal images. A slice of bread, a boiled potato, a handful of rice. His dreams, when he managed to sleep, were saturated with the smells and textures of sustenance, and he would wake with his jaw aching from grinding his teeth, his tongue probing the inside of his mouth as if searching for crumbs that weren't there. But the physical hunger was only the surface layer. Beneath it, running parallel to it like a second narrative written in invisible ink, was something far more disturbing. It started with the sounds. On the morning of the 8th day, Scott was sitting by the window, watching the snow fall in fat, lazy flakes that seemed to fall upward as often as they fell down, when he heard his wife's voice. Not a memory, not an auditory hallucination of the kind he had documented in his research. Those tended to be fragmentary, nonsensical, the product of a starving brain misfiring in the dark. This was clear, coherent, and unmistakably Sarah. She was calling his name from the tree line, her voice carrying across the frozen meadow with a clarity that defied the acoustics of the landscape. "Scott, Scott, can you hear me? I'm so cold. Please, Scott, I need you to come find me." He was on his feet before he realized he had moved, his heart hammering, his mouth dry. Sarah was in Chicago, had been for months, had filed the divorce papers 3 weeks before he left for the woods. She had no idea where he was. She wouldn't have come looking for him even if she had known. But the voice was hers, every intonation and hesitation perfectly reproduced, and when he pressed his face against the cold glass, he thought he could see a figure standing at the edge of the birch stand, wrapped in a coat he recognized, her hair pulled back in the messy bun she always wore when she was working from home. "Sarah," he whispered, his breath fogging the window. "Sarah, is that?" "It's not her." Diana's voice came from behind him, flat and empty, and Scott spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance. She was sitting in the corner, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that seemed to exist only for her. "It sounded like my mother. Yesterday. She was calling from the kitchen, asking if I wanted soup. My mother's been dead for 4 years." Scott's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, sounded like? You heard it too?" "We all heard it," Marcus said from the table where he was trying to whittle a stick into something with a knife that shook in his grip. "I heard my sister. Elias heard his old coach. Vance heard." He paused, the knife stilling. "Vance won't say what he heard, but he heard something. We all did. It's part of the process." "Part of the process?" Scott's voice was rising, cracking, the edges fraying with panic and hunger. "This isn't part of any process I've ever designed. This is." "The thinning," Vance said, emerging from the bedroom with a journal in his hand, his face gaunt but glowing with an inner light that made Scott want to grab him and shake him until that light went out. "The Wendigo doesn't attack immediately. It doesn't need to. It has time. It has all the time in the world. What it does first is separate the wheat from the chaff. It finds out which of us are truly empty, truly ready, and which of us are still clinging to the old world, the old needs, the old identities. The voices are its way of testing us. It takes the shape of what we love most, what we miss most, what we hunger for beyond food, and it offers it to us. If we go to it, if we follow the voice into the trees, we fail. We prove that we're still bound by human attachments. But if we resist, if we stay in the cabin and let the voice fade, then we pass. Then we're ready for the next stage." "The Wendigo," Scott repeated, tasting the word. It felt ancient in his mouth, heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with its syllables. "You actually believe there's a Wendigo out there? An actual, literal?" "I don't believe it, Scott. I know it. I've seen it." Vance's eyes were very bright, very calm. "Not the way you're thinking, not as a physical thing running through the trees, but I've felt it. In the Starvation Pit, when I first came here 6 months ago, I emptied myself to the point of death. I was clinically dead for 90 seconds, Scott. My heart stopped, and in those 90 seconds I saw it. I felt it. I understood what hunger really is. It's not the absence of food. It's the presence of something else. Something that has been waiting since before the first human walked upright, waiting for someone to open the door wide enough for it to slip through." Scott wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as the raving of a man whose brain had been permanently damaged by oxygen deprivation. But he couldn't laugh, because he had heard Sarah's voice, and it had been so real, so achingly, impossibly real, that the idea of it being a mere hallucination felt more absurd than the alternative. And because in the days that followed, the voices grew louder, more insistent, more varied. It wasn't just loved ones anymore. It was colleagues he hadn't thought of in years, calling to offer him his old job back. It was his father, dead a decade, advising him on how to build a fire. It was his own voice, calling from somewhere in the woods behind the cabin, reading excerpts from his own research papers back to him in a tone of gentle mockery. The voices never screamed. That was the worst part. They were always calm, reasonable, loving. They spoke of warmth and safety and food, of all the things that Scott had denied himself, and they spoke from a distance that seemed to recede with every step he took toward the window. "It's getting closer," Elias observed on the 12th day. He was the most changed of all of them. His cheeks had sunken until they were concave planes. His eyes had taken on a luminosity that seemed to produce its own light, and he moved with a fluidity that made him look less like a starving man and more like a predatory animal testing its muscles. "The voices are closer. Yesterday they were at the tree line. This morning they were at the woodpile. By tomorrow they'll be at the door." "And then what?" Scott asked. He was wrapped in 3 blankets and still shivering. His body temperature dropped to a level that should have been concerning, but that Vance monitored with nothing more than a serene smile. "What happens when they reach the door?" "Then we see if we're strong enough to keep it closed," Elias said, and his smile was the smile of a man who had already decided what he would do when the knocking started. The food supplies began to disappear on the 14th day. Not all at once, but gradually, stealthily, in a way that suggested intelligence rather than accident. A bag of dried beans that had been stored in the pantry was found torn open, its contents scattered across the floor in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost artistic. The remaining livestock, 3 chickens that Vance had kept in a coop behind the cabin, were gone, their feathers scattered in a trail that led toward the birch stand and then stopped abruptly, as if whatever had taken them had simply vanished into the air. "Predators," Scott said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A fox, maybe, or a marten." "A fox that stacks feathers in a spiral pattern?" Diana asked, holding up a handful of white down that had been arranged on the snow in a coil that tightened inward toward a center point that was empty, hungry, waiting. "A marten that opens latches from the outside." They checked the locks. They checked the windows. They found nothing disturbed, nothing broken, nothing that suggested forced entry. But every morning there was less food, and every morning the voices in the woods were closer, and every morning the hunger in Scott's belly had spread outward until it seemed to encompass his entire being, until he could feel it in his fingertips and his kneecaps and the roots of his hair. The first death occurred on the 17th day, though they didn't know it was a death until the 18th. Marcus had been the weakest of them from the start, his body already damaged by years of performance-enhancing drugs and the punishing regimen of marathon training. The fast had hit him harder than the others, reducing him to a shambling skeleton who spent most of his time lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling, muttering calculations under his breath, caloric burn rates, metabolic pathways, the exact number of hours a human body could survive without water. On the morning of the 17th day, he sat up suddenly, his eyes wide and clear in a way they hadn't been for days, and said, "I hear her. She's finally here. She's come to take me home." "Who?" Scott asked, but Marcus was already moving, already on his feet, his emaciated body moving with a speed that seemed impossible given his condition. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides, threw open the door, and stepped out into the snow wearing nothing but his thin cotton shirt and pajama pants. The cold didn't seem to touch him. He walked across the meadow with his arms slightly outstretched, his face turned upward, a smile of absolute peace spreading across his features. "Marcus," Scott shouted, lunging for the door, but Vance caught his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Don't," Vance said softly. "He made his choice. He's following the voice. This is how it works, Scott. This is how the thinning separates the ready from the unready. He's going to die out there. We have to." "He's already dead," Vance said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a terrible, serene acceptance. "He was dead the moment he decided to follow. The Wendigo doesn't kill you, Scott. It invites you, and if you accept the invitation." They watched Marcus reach the tree line. They watched him pause, his head cocked to one side as if listening to something that the rest of them couldn't hear. And then, with a movement that was almost tender, almost loving, he reached out his hand toward a shadow between two birch trees, a shadow that was too tall, too narrow, too wrong to be cast by anything in the visible world. The shadow moved. That was all Scott saw, a ripple in the darkness that seemed to absorb the dim winter light rather than block it. And then Marcus was gone, not dragged away, not screaming, not struggling, simply gone as if he had stepped through a door that had opened in the air itself. One moment he was there, his hand outstretched, his face radiant with joy. The next moment the meadow was empty except for footprints that stopped abruptly at the tree line, as if the ground itself had refused to hold his weight any longer. "We should look for him," Scott said, his voice a whisper. "We should at least." "We won't find him," Diana said. She hadn't moved from her corner, hadn't even looked up from the blanket she was methodically unraveling, thread by thread. "Not his body, anyway. The Wendigo doesn't leave bodies. It leaves impressions, echoes you'll see." They searched anyway. Scott insisted, and Elias and Diana accompanied him more out of listlessness than conviction. They followed Marcus's footprints to the tree line, and there they stopped, just as Scott had known they would. But beyond the tree line, in the deeper woods where the birch gave way to pine and the light failed almost entirely, they found something else. It was blood. Not a lot of it, just a few drops, frozen on the bark of a young sapling and then a smear on a rock, and then a trail that was so thin, so parsimonious, that it seemed less like the result of an injury and more like a deliberate marking, a breadcrumb trail left by something that wanted to be followed. The trail didn't lead forward into the woods. It led upward. Scott craned his neck, following the smears with his eyes, and felt his stomach clench with a spasm of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood climbed. It climbed the trunk of a massive pine, rising in a spiral pattern that wrapped around the bark in bands of frozen crimson, rising higher and higher until it reached the canopy, 15 feet above their heads. And there, caught in the branches, dripping slowly down onto the snow below in a steady, patient rhythm, were Marcus's clothes. His thin cotton shirt, his pajama pants, his threadbare socks. They were arranged with a care that was almost reverent, spread across the branches like a display in a macabre boutique, and they were empty, completely, perfectly empty. The blood that had filled them was now scattered across the snow in a pattern that, when viewed from below, formed a shape that Scott's hunger-addled brain identified as a mouth. A wide, hungry mouth, open and waiting. "The trail leads upward," Elias observed, his voice clinical, detached. "That means it took him into the canopy. Wendigos are arboreal hunters. They use the trees to move, to stalk, to drop down on their prey. It's textbook behavior." "Textbook behavior," Scott rounded on him, his fear transforming into a rage that felt like the first warm thing he had experienced in weeks. "A man just vanished into thin air and you're talking about textbook behavior. This isn't a field guide, Elias. This isn't a research paper. This is exactly what we came here for," Elias interrupted, his voice still calm, still maddeningly reasonable. "This is the threshold, Scott. The moment where the theoretical becomes the actual." Marcus crossed over. He emptied himself completely, and the Wendigo accepted him. He's not dead. He's transcended. He's become part of the hunger itself. Scott wanted to scream, to grab Elias by his skeletal shoulders and shake him until the madness fell out of his eyes like loose change. But he didn't have the strength. The fast had reduced him to a creature of pure reaction, a bundle of nerves and instincts held together by willpower and terror. He turned back to the tree, to the empty clothes in the canopy, to the blood that formed a mouth in the snow, and he felt something inside him shift. Not acceptance, not resignation, but a kind of terrible understanding, a recognition that the rules he had spent his life studying, the rules of biology, of physics, of rational cause and effect, were merely the ground floor of a building that extended much, much deeper into the dark. They didn't find Marcus's body. They didn't find any part of him. What they found when they returned to the cabin and the light began to fail was that his cot had been remade, the blankets tucked with military precision, and on the pillow lay a single object. A human tooth, perfectly intact, the root still attached, the enamel gleaming in the firelight with a luster that seemed almost wet. An offering, Vance said, picking it up with reverent fingers. A keepsake. The Wendigo always leaves something behind. It's its way of saying thank you, of saying that the gift was received. A gift, Scott repeated, and the word tasted like ash. He was a person, Gregory. He was your friend. He was a vessel, Vance corrected, placing the tooth in a small wooden box that he kept on the mantel. And now he's something else, something better, something that will never hunger again because it has become the hunger itself. That night the wind changed. It blew from the north, from the deep woods, and it carried a smell that made Scott's already ravaged stomach twist with a nausea that had nothing to do with the absence of food. It was the smell of the clearing, the smell of the thing that had found him wanting. But now it was closer, much closer, and beneath the smell of decay, beneath the sharpness of ozone and old blood, there was something new, something that Scott recognized with a thrill of horror that went beyond fear into a realm of terrible intimacy. It was the smell of Marcus. Marcus's cologne, Marcus's sweat, Marcus's particular and individual scent, transformed and amplified and corrupted into something that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The Wendigo was wearing him, Scott realized with a clarity that felt like ice water injected directly into his veins. The Wendigo had consumed him, and now it was using his scent, his voice, his memories as bait for the next course. "It's learning us," Scott whispered into the darkness of the cabin, his words barely audible over the wind. "It's not just eating them, it's studying us, it's learning how to be us." No one answered. Diana was asleep, or in a trance, or somewhere in between. Elias was sitting by the window, staring into the dark, his lips moving in silent conversation with someone only he could see. And Vance was standing in the center of the room, his arms spread wide, his face turned upward, his body swaying slightly to a rhythm that matched the wind's howl. He looked like a man in the throes of religious ecstasy, or like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand. "Soon," Vance murmured, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to come from deeper in his chest than human anatomy should allow. "So soon now. The table is set. The guests are arriving, and the hunger is endless." Scott pulled the blankets over his head and tried to remember what it felt like to be full. He tried to remember the taste of bread, the weight of a meal in his stomach, the simple, animal satisfaction of satiety. But the memories were fading, replaced by a different kind of fullness, a fullness of emptiness, a satiation of the void that whispered to him in a voice that sounded more and more like his own with every passing hour. The Wendigo was inside now. Not physically. The doors were locked, the windows were barred, and nothing had crossed the threshold. But it was inside nonetheless, moving through their thoughts like a wolf moving through a flock of sheep, nipping here, tasting there, herding them toward a conclusion that had been written long before any of them had been born. And somewhere in the woods, somewhere high in the canopy, where the branches creaked and swayed under impossible weight, something that had once been Marcus Webb began to sing a lullaby in a voice that was almost, but not quite, human. By the 19th day, the distinction between hunger and self had dissolved entirely. Scott no longer knew where his body ended and his need began. They had become a single continuous substance, a waveform of craving that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He had lost 47 pounds. His cheekbones jutted like cliff faces from the sunken terrain of his face. His eyes, reflected in the cabin's single cracked mirror, were the eyes of a stranger, dark, luminous, burning with a light that seemed to come from somewhere behind the retina, somewhere deeper than biology could explain. The Wendigo had not attacked again, not directly, but its presence had become as constant and inescapable as gravity. They heard it moving through the woods at night, the heavy, stuttering footsteps that would pause outside the cabin and then continue, as if the creature were circling them, pacing the perimeter of some invisible enclosure. They found its marks in the morning, clawed furrows in the ice that were 10 feet apart, impossible strides that spoke of limbs stretched to lengths no natural skeleton could support. They found the remains of their food stores arranged in patterns around the cabin's foundation, the dried beans sorted by color into spirals, the tea leaves pressed into the snow in shapes that looked almost like letters in an alphabet Scott almost recognized. And they found the voices. The voices were no longer confined to the tree line. They spoke from the chimney, from the gaps in the floorboards, from the very air itself. Scott's wife called to him from the fireplace, her voice warm and forgiving, offering him a dinner he could almost smell: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. His mother called from beneath his cot, her voice thin and reedy, asking if he was eating enough, if he was taking care of himself. And Marcus called from everywhere and nowhere, his voice transformed into something that was layered, choral, as if 1,000 versions of him were speaking in imperfect unison from the depths of a cavern that had no bottom. "Come and see," Marcus whispered. "Come and see how beautiful it is, how empty, how free." They stopped sleeping. Sleep was too dangerous, too vulnerable. They took turns keeping watch, though what they were watching for was unclear. The Wendigo didn't need darkness to move. It had been seen in full daylight, a flicker of wrongness at the corner of vision, a shadow that moved against the sun. Elias was the first to stop eating entirely, declaring on the 18th day that he had crossed the threshold, and no longer required even water. He sat by the window with his hands folded in his lap, his eyes open and unblinking, his chest rising and falling in shallower and shallower increments, until it was almost impossible to tell if he was breathing at all. "He's becoming," Vance said, watching Elias with an expression that was equal parts envy and awe. "He's emptying himself completely. The Wendigo will come for him soon. It will come for all of us soon." "Becoming what?" Scott asked, but Vance only smiled and turned away, and in the firelight his skin seemed to sag from his bones like wet cloth, as if the flesh itself were losing the will to hold its shape. The creature's mimicry had evolved beyond voices. On the morning of the 20th day, the final day of the fast, Scott woke to find that the cabin had been changed. Not dramatically, nothing was broken, nothing was missing, but subtly, insidiously, in ways that made his already fragile sense of reality begin to splinter. The table had been moved 3 inches to the left. The chairs were arranged in a different order. The blankets on his cot had been folded in a pattern he didn't recognize, a precise geometric arrangement that reminded him of the Starvation Pit's stone circle. And on the wall above the fireplace, written in what looked like soot or ash or something darker, were words that Scott hadn't written, that none of them had written, in a hand that looked almost like his own but was slightly wrong, slightly slanted, slightly too precise. "You chase more, but you are less. You hunger and you hunger and you hunger. I am the hunger. I am the more. I am what waits at the end of every empty plate." "It's reading our minds," Diana said. She had not spoken in 2 days, and her voice was a rasp, a ruin of vocal cords pushed past their limits. "It's not just mimicking our voices. It's mimicking our thoughts, our fears, our desires." "That's impossible," Scott said automatically, though the word felt hollow, a talisman whose power had long since drained away. "Is it?" Diana turned to face him, and her eyes were different now. The pupils had dilated to consume the irises entirely, leaving only black pools that reflected nothing. You've spent your whole life telling people to empty themselves, Scott, to deny their bodies, to transcend their needs. Did you never wonder what might be waiting in the emptiness? Did you never think that the void you created might be occupied by something that was there first? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than the wood smoke, more suffocating than the cabin's stale air. Scott had no answer. He had spent his career chasing transcendence, chasing the idea that the body was a machine that could be optimized, that hunger was a weakness to be overcome, that need was the enemy of greatness. He had never considered that the opposite might be true, that the body's needs were a kind of protection, a barrier that kept something else at bay. That emptiness wasn't liberation, but invitation. The attack, when it came, was not what any of them expected. It was not a savage mauling, not a burst of violence from the darkness. It was a lure, subtle and patient and infinitely cruel. Elias was the one who heard it first. He had been sitting by the window for 3 days, motionless, barely breathing, but on the morning of the 20th day he suddenly stood up, his body moving with a smoothness that belied his emaciated condition. "She's here," he said, his voice clear and calm, entirely at odds with his appearance. "She's finally come for me. She's waiting in the meadow." "Who?" Scott asked, but Elias was already moving toward the door, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. "My sister," Elias said, his hand on the latch. "She died when I was 12. She drowned in the lake behind our house. I never got to say goodbye, but she's here now. She's come to take me home." "Elias, no." Scott lunged forward, but his weakened body moved too slowly, his depleted muscles betraying him at the crucial moment. Elias opened the door and stepped out into the snow, and the light that fell across his face was not the gray-white of the overcast sky, but something else, something warmer and more golden, something that made him smile with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated joy that Scott felt his heart break even as his mind screamed warnings. Elias walked across the meadow with his arms outstretched, just as Marcus had done, and at the tree line he paused. But this time, Scott saw what waited for him. He saw it clearly, without obstruction, without doubt. The Wendigo stood between 2 birch trees, and it was taller than Scott had imagined, taller than the trees themselves. Its body was a study in starvation made flesh, limbs that stretched like taffy to impossible lengths, joints that bent in directions no joint should bend, a torso that was little more than a cage of ribs wrapped in skin the color and texture of old parchment. Its head sat too low between shoulders that jutted like broken wings, and its face, oh God, its face, was a lipless grin of teeth that were too long, too sharp, too numerous, set in gums that had receded to expose the bone beneath. The eyes were the worst part. They were human eyes, or had been once, set deep in sockets that were bruised and hollow, and they burned with a light that was not reflection but emission, a cold fire that spoke of appetites that could never be satisfied. But what made Scott scream, what made him fall to his knees in the snow and vomit the last bitter dregs of bile from his empty stomach, was not the creature itself. It was what the creature was wearing. Around its neck, draped like a stole or a garland, were faces. Human faces, stretched and dried and preserved, their mouths frozen in expressions of ecstasy and terror and something that might have been gratitude. Scott recognized them. He recognized Marcus's gaunt features, transformed by the drying process into something that looked almost peaceful. And beneath Marcus's face, overlapping it, was another face that Scott didn't know, a woman's features, young and beautiful and contorted in a rictus of absolute, transcendent joy. The Wendigo reached out with one impossibly long arm, and its claws, those antler-like appendages that ended in points sharp enough to split wood, closed around Elias' shoulder with a gentleness that was more horrifying than any violence could have been. Elias did not struggle. He leaned into the touch, his face turned upward, his eyes closed, a smile of perfect serenity spreading across his features. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for filling me." The Wendigo's grin widened, and then with a movement that was too fast to follow, too fluid to be real, it lifted Elias into the air and carried him into the trees. Scott heard no scream. He heard only a brief, wet sound like a fruit being peeled, and then silence. Absolute, complete, and terrible silence. When he looked up, the Wendigo was gone. Elias was gone. The meadow was empty except for the footprints that led to the tree line and stopped, and a single object that lay in the snow where Elias had stood. A human ear, perfectly preserved, the lobe still attached, the cartilage still flexible. Another offering, another keepsake, another proof that the gift had been received. Vance found him there 10 minutes later, kneeling in the snow, the ear clutched in his frozen hand. "Two," Vance said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Two have crossed over. The hunger is growing stronger. Can you feel it, Scott? Can you feel it filling the space around us?" Scott could feel it. He could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in the hollow spaces behind his eyes. The Wendigo was not just a creature anymore. It was a presence, an atmosphere, a change in the barometric pressure of reality itself. Every time it fed, it grew stronger, larger, more real. Every time it consumed one of them, it absorbed not just their flesh but their hunger, their need, their desperate desire for more. It was becoming what they had wanted to become, a being of pure appetite, unburdened by the limitations of biology or physics or morality. "We have to leave," Scott said, his voice raw. "We have to get out of here, now, before it comes for the rest of us." Vance looked at him with pity. "Leave? Scott, we can't leave. The ritual isn't complete. The door isn't fully open. If we leave now, the hunger will follow us. It will follow us anywhere we go because we've invited it in. We've made ourselves part of it. The only way out is through." "The only way out is through," Scott repeated, and the words tasted like prophecy, like a death sentence spoken in the voice of a judge who had already signed the warrant. They made the decision to leave together, or what passed for togetherness in the shattered remains of their group. Diana was catatonic, barely responsive, her body curled into a ball on her cot, her eyes fixed on the ceiling with an expression that suggested she was seeing something far more interesting than the rough-hewn logs. Vance was opposed to leaving, but he was also opposed to staying, caught in a paralysis of indecision that had reduced him to a muttering wreck who spent hours arranging and rearranging the objects on the mantelpiece into patterns that seemed to mean something only to him. Scott was the only one who seemed capable of action, and his action was simple, brutal, and desperate. They would walk to the vehicles. They would drive away. They would never look back. The vehicles were parked at the end of a logging road that wound through the woods for 3 miles before connecting to the main highway. They had arrived by that road, bumping along in Vance's ancient Land Rover, navigating by GPS and luck through terrain that had seemed rugged but manageable. Scott remembered the journey clearly. He remembered the landmarks, the fallen oak that blocked half the road, the granite outcropping shaped like a sleeping dog, the rusted metal gate that marked the boundary of the national forest. He remembered the distance, 3 miles, 45 minutes on foot, even in deep snow. They set out at dawn on the 21st day, the day after Elias' disappearance. Scott half-carried Diana, her feet dragging in the snow, her head lolling against his shoulder. Vance walked ahead of them, his movements jerky and erratic, his head constantly swiveling from side to side as if he expected to see something waiting in the trees. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the snow had begun again, fine dry flakes that stung like sand against exposed skin. They walked for an hour. The logging road should have been visible by now, should have been visible 30 minutes ago, but the trees had changed. The birch stand had given way to a dense thicket of pine that Scott didn't remember, their trunks so close together that passage required turning sideways and squeezing through gaps that seemed to narrow even as they passed. The snow grew deeper, rising to their knees, then their thighs, then their waists. And the landmarks were wrong. The fallen oak was there, but it was on the left side of the path instead of the right. The granite outcropping was there, but it was a quarter mile from where it should have been, and its shape had changed. The sleeping dog transformed into something that looked more like a crouching figure with its head buried between its knees. The rusted gate was there, but when they reached it, they found that it was not a gate at all but a framework of branches woven together in a pattern that was almost identical to the arrangement of tea leaves on the cabin floor. "It's moved things," Diana whispered, her first words in hours. "It rearranged the forest. It built a maze around us." "That's impossible," Scott said, but the word had become a reflex, meaningless, empty. He looked around at the trees that seemed to lean inward, at the snow that fell in patterns that were almost but not quite random, at the sky that seemed lower than it had been, pressed down by a weight that was more than weather. "We just need to keep walking. Straight line. Due south. The highway is south." He pulled out his compass, his fingers clumsy in his gloves, and held it level. The needle spun lazily, completing a full rotation before settling on a direction that was not south but something else, something that seemed to shift even as he watched. He shook it, tapped it, held it at different angles. The needle continued to point in a direction that felt wrong, that pulled at his gut with a sensation that was almost nausea. "Compass is dead," he said, his voice flat. "Or the magnetic field here is wrong." "Or the Wendigo is the compass now," Vance said, and his smile was the smile of a man who had finally accepted the terms of a bargain he had been negotiating for years. "It doesn't want us to leave, Scott. It wants us to stay. It wants us to finish what we started." They walked for another hour, or what felt like an hour. Time had become as unreliable as space, stretching and compressing in ways that made Scott's head ache. They followed what they believed was a straight line, breaking branches as they passed to mark their trail, calling out to each other in voices that were swallowed by the snow and the silence. And then, with a suddenness that made Scott's heart lurch in his chest, they emerged into a clearing that they recognized. It was the Starvation Pit, the shallow depression lined with black stones, the birch bark arranged in patterns that looked almost like writing, the dark soil, softer than the surrounding ground, that seemed to pulse with a warmth that was impossible in the frozen landscape. They had walked in a straight line for 2 hours, and they had ended up exactly where they had started. "No," Scott said, his voice cracking. "No, no, no, we marked the trees, we broke branches, we should be." "It put them back," Diana said. She had straightened up, was standing on her own now, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "It fixed the branches. It erased our marks. It wants us here, Scott. It wants us to understand that there's nowhere to go, that the only escape is the one it offers." "And what does it offer?" Scott asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Vance answered, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to come from deeper in his chest than human anatomy should allow. "It offers completion. It offers the end of wanting. It offers the transformation that you always promised your clients, Scott, the transcendence of the body, the liberation from need. It just requires one thing." "What?" "A feast," Vance said, and his eyes were no longer human, were no longer anything that Scott could recognize as belonging to the man he had once known. "A feast that satisfies not the stomach but the soul, an offering of identity, of selfhood, of the very thing that makes us human, and once that offering is made—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Scott understood. The Wendigo didn't just consume flesh. It consumed the hungry parts of the self, the ambition, the desire, the endless, aching need for more that had driven them all to this place. And once those parts were consumed, once the self was stripped down to its barest, most essential core, what remained? What was left when the wanting was gone? They made their way back to the cabin in a silence that was broken only by the crunch of snow and the distant, intermittent sound of something heavy moving through the canopy above them. Scott didn't look up. He didn't want to see what was walking the high road, what was watching them from above with eyes that burned with a hunger older than humanity itself. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, on the trail of footprints that seemed to lead in both directions at once, and he tried to remember what it felt like to be safe. The cabin was as they had left it, but the message on the wall had changed. The words written in soot or ash or blood had been erased, replaced by a new message in a hand that was now unmistakably Scott's own, though he had no memory of writing it. You cannot outrun what you are. You cannot escape what you invited. The feast is prepared. The table is set. All that remains is for the host to take his seat. The host, Scott repeated, his voice a whisper. It wants me. It always wanted me. It wanted all of us, Vance said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in his armor of fanatical certainty. But you were the designer, Scott. You were the architect. You built the door. We're just the ones who walked through it. Scott stood in the center of the cabin, surrounded by the ruins of his ambition and the wreckage of his convictions, and felt something inside him break. Not his spirit, that had been broken days ago. Not his will, that had been eroded by hunger and fear until it was little more than a memory. No, what broke was his resistance, his belief that there was a way out, a solution, a scientific or rational or even merely human answer to the thing that had encircled them. He had spent his life believing that the body could be mastered, that need could be overcome, that the human will was stronger than any force the world could bring to bear against it. And now, faced with a creature that was the literal embodiment of appetite, he understood that his entire philosophy had been not just wrong but catastrophically, suicidally misguided. The body was not the enemy. The hunger was not a weakness to be overcome. They were defenses, walls built by evolution over millions of years to keep something out, and he had spent his career teaching people to tear those walls down. I'm going to end this, he said, and his voice was steady, calmer than he felt. I'm going to find a way to stop it. How? Diana asked. She had retreated to her corner again, her blanket drawn up to her chin, her eyes empty. You can't fight it. You can't negotiate with it. You can't even run from it. What can you possibly do? Scott didn't answer. He was looking at the mantelpiece, at the wooden box where Vance had placed Marcus's tooth, and beyond it at the knives in the kitchen area, not sharp, not surgical, but sharp enough for what he was planning. Confuse it, he said softly. Trick it. Offer it something that doesn't taste like what it's expecting. He didn't explain further. He couldn't. The plan was forming in his mind even as he spoke, a desperate, insane stratagem born of exhaustion and hunger and the last dying embers of a pride that refused to let him die as prey. If the Wendigo fed on identity, on the specific, individual hunger of each victim, then what would happen if he offered it a self that was already consumed? A feast of nothing, a meal of absence, an identity that had been digested before it was served. He would have to become the hunger. He would have to offer himself so completely, so absolutely, that there was nothing left for the Wendigo to take. He would have to strip himself down to a core so empty that the creature would choke on the vacuum. Or he would have to offer it something so unexpected, so confusing, that its predatory instincts would be overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of the offering. He looked at his hands, at his fingers, at the 10 digits that had typed his research papers and signed his checks and shaken the hands of the clients whose lives he had ruined in pursuit of a vision that had led him here, to this cabin, to this frozen hell, where the only thing that mattered was the endless, aching void of appetite. He knew what he had to do. He didn't know if it would work, but he knew, with a certainty that went beyond thought, that if he did nothing, the Wendigo would take them all. And the last thing he would see, before his face was added to the garland around that terrible, grinning neck, would be the reflection of his own hunger in eyes that had been human once, long ago, before they had learned that the only way to escape the void was to become it. The snow fell harder as the sun began to set, painting the world in shades of gray and white that seemed to bleed together at the edges, dissolving the boundary between earth and sky, between the real and the imagined, between the living and the hungry. And in the center of the clearing, the Starvation Pit steamed gently, the dark soil warm and waiting, the stones arranged in their ancient circle like teeth around an open mouth. The feast was about to begin. The night of the 21st day was the longest night Scott had ever experienced, longer than any winter solstice, longer than any sleepless vigil, longer than the accumulated darkness of every closed eye and turned back he had ever endured. The cabin had become a pressure chamber, a sealed environment where the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation, with the weight of something drawing near. Diana had fallen into a state that was neither sleep nor wakefulness, a shallow breathing unconsciousness that left her eyes partially open, the whites visible beneath lids that fluttered with rapid, dream-touched movements. Vance had disappeared. Not physically. His body was still there, still seated by the fire, still breathing in shallow sips of air. But his mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere deeper than the trance he had maintained for days. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his lips moving in silent recitation, his eyes fixed on a point in the flames that seemed to hold a secret only he could read. Scott sat apart from them, in the corner farthest from the fire, where the cold bit deepest and the shadows gathered thickest. He had taken one of the kitchen knives, not the largest or the sharpest, but the one whose handle fit his palm with the most familiarity, the one that felt like an extension of his own will. He had sharpened it against the stone hearth until the edge could split a hair, until the blade gleamed in the firelight with a liquid intensity that made it look wet. And he had sat with it in his lap, his hands resting on the worn wooden handle, his eyes fixed on the door. He understood now what he had to do. The Wendigo fed on identity, on the specific, individual hunger that made each person unique, that drove them to want and need and consume. It didn't just eat bodies, it ate the wanting itself, the desperate, aching void that lived in the center of every human heart. And the more specific the hunger, the more potent the meal. Marcus had wanted transcendence through physical exhaustion. Elias had wanted reunion with his dead sister. Vance wanted something that Scott was no longer sure he could name, something that had started as scientific curiosity and curdled into religious mania. But Scott's hunger was different. Scott's hunger was the hunger of the architect, the designer, the man who had built the door and then wondered what lay on the other side. He had spent his life trying to empty people, to strip them of their needs and their comforts and their petty desires, to reduce them to pure vessels of will. And in doing so, he had created the perfect conditions for the Wendigo to enter. He had built a philosophy of emptiness, and the Wendigo had simply moved into the space he had cleared. To confuse it, to trick it, he would have to offer it something that was already consumed. He would have to become the hunger so completely that there was nothing left to eat. He would have to strip himself of his own identity, his own desires, his own desperate need for validation and recognition, and the sweet, intoxicating rush of being right. He would have to become a void within a void, an emptiness so absolute that the Wendigo would choke on the vacuum. But first, he would have to make the offering, the physical offering, the fingers from the vision, from the flash forward that had opened this story and that would close it, the neat pile of severed digits that Officer Hale would find in the clearing, the fingers that had signed the papers and shaken the hands and typed the words that had led them all here. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if the Wendigo could be tricked, if it could be confused, if it operated on any logic that human understanding could access. But he knew that Diana was still alive, still breathing, still human enough to be saved. And he knew that if he did nothing, she would follow Marcus and Elias into the canopy, into the grinning maw of the thing that had been waiting for them since before the first human set foot in these woods. The knife was cold against his palm. He pressed the edge against the base of his left pinky finger, feeling the skin dimple and then part, feeling the first hot welling of blood that was darker and thicker than he had expected. The pain, when it came, was extraordinary, not just the localized sharpness of the cut, but a radiating wave that traveled up his arm and into his chest, making his heart stutter and his breath catch. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He drew the blade through the joint with a sawing motion that made his teeth grind and his eyes water, and then the finger was free, separated from his hand, lying in his palm like a pale larva, still warm, still twitching with the last confused signals of severed nerves. He didn't scream. He didn't make a sound. He set the finger aside on the floorboards where it left a smear of blood that looked black in the firelight, and he moved on to the next. The ring finger, the middle finger, the index finger, the thumb. Each one was harder than the last, not because the physical act grew more difficult, but because the psychological barrier grew higher, because some part of his mind was screaming at him to stop, to think, to remember that he was a human being and human beings didn't do this, didn't sit in frozen cabins and systematically dismember themselves as offerings to monsters that didn't exist. But the monster did exist. He knew that now. He had seen it. He had smelled it. He had felt its attention turn upon him like a searchlight in the clearing, and he knew that the only thing more real than the Wendigo was the hunger that had summoned it. The hunger that he had fed and nurtured and refined into a philosophy that had destroyed lives and now, finally, was destroying his own. When the left hand was done, he held it up to the firelight and looked at it with a detachment that terrified him more than the pain. 4 stumps, ragged and oozing, the bone gleaming white where the blade had scraped against it. And on the floor, arranged in a neat row, 5 fingers that had been part of him moments before and were now just meat, just objects, just offerings to something that didn't know the difference between a finger and a soul. He should have stopped there. The plan, such as it was, required only a symbolic gesture, only enough blood and pain to confuse the creature's senses, to make it believe that Scott had already been consumed, already been emptied, already been added to the collection of faces around its terrible neck. But some part of him, some part that had been waiting for this moment since the first day he had denied himself a meal in pursuit of some impossible ideal, knew that symbolism wasn't enough. The Wendigo didn't deal in symbols. It dealt in substance, in the actual physical reality of consumption. He moved to the right hand. The second round was both easier and harder. Easier because his body was already in shock, already flooding his system with endorphins and adrenaline that dulled the pain to a distant, manageable throb. Harder because he knew what was coming, because the anticipation of each cut was almost worse than the cut itself, because some part of him was already grieving the hands he would never have again, the life he would never return to, the person he had been and would never be again. When it was done, when both hands were reduced to mangled stumps and the floor around him was slippery with blood that had already begun to freeze, he gathered the fingers. He stacked them with a care that was almost tender, almost loving, building a small cairn of his own flesh that mirrored the one he had seen in the vision, the one that Officer Hale would find in the clearing. And then, with movements that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone far away and long ago, he wrapped his ruined hands in strips of birch bark that he had peeled from the woodpile, binding the stumps in a crude tourniquet that would keep him alive long enough to finish what he had started. "What are you doing?" Diana's voice came from the corner, thin and cracked, but alert in a way she hadn't been for days. "Scott, what have you done?" "What I had to do," he said, and his voice was calm, terrifyingly calm, the voice of a man who had crossed a line and found that the territory on the other side was not as alien as he had expected. "What I should have done years ago. I'm offering it something that doesn't make sense, something that will confuse it, something that will buy you time." "Time for what?" "Time to run." He turned to face her, and in the firelight his face must have been a mask of horror, pale, drawn, streaked with blood that had sprayed across his cheeks during the severing. "There's a snowmobile in the shed behind the cabin. Vance showed me the first day. The keys are in the ignition. I want you to take it and drive south and don't stop until you reach the highway. Don't look back. Don't think about me. Just go." "I can't leave you," she whispered, but her eyes were already moving toward the door, already calculating distances and speeds and the probability of survival. "You can, you will, because if you stay, we both die, and if you go, at least one of us lives." He managed a smile, though it split his cracked lips and sent a fresh trickle of blood down his chin. "That's the math, Diana. That's the only equation that matters now." She stared at him for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw something that might have been pity, or might have been understanding, or might have been merely the reflection of his own madness. Then she nodded once and pulled herself to her feet. She moved toward the door with a speed that spoke of preserved strength, of a body that had not been as thoroughly emptied as the others, and with her hand on the latch she paused and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said, "for whatever it's worth." "It's worth everything," he said. "Go." She went. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air that made the fire gutter and dim, and then it closed behind her and Scott was alone. Alone with Vance, who had not moved, had not spoken, had not acknowledged the blood or the fingers or the desperate transaction that had just taken place. Alone with the knife, which lay on the floor beside him, its blade dulled by bone and gristle. Alone with the pile of his own fingers, which seemed to gleam with a wet, organic luster that was almost beautiful in the firelight. And alone with the Wendigo, which was coming. He felt it before he heard it, a pressure against his mind, the same psychic gravity that had paralyzed him at the edge of the Starvation Pit, but stronger now, more focused, more personal. It was tasting him, sampling the air, savoring the scent of blood and fear and the particular, piquant flavor of a man who had finally, completely, emptied himself. And then he heard it, the footsteps, the dragging, the wet rhythmic sound of something massive moving through snow that should have been too deep to support such weight. It was at the door. He knew it with a certainty that bypassed his senses entirely, that resonated in the hollow spaces where his fingers had been. He could feel its presence pressing against the wood, testing the latch, smelling the blood that had seeped through the floorboards and into the frozen ground below. And he could feel its confusion, a palpable hesitation in the psychic pressure, as if the creature were encountering a flavor it didn't recognize, a scent that didn't match the prey it had been tracking. Scott stood up. He walked to the door, his ruined hands held out in front of him, the birch bark bandages dark with seeping blood. He opened the door. The Wendigo filled the frame. It was larger than he remembered, larger than it had been in the clearing, as if each feeding had added to its mass, its height, its terrible, ravenous presence. Its skin was the color of old parchment stretched over a frame that had been broken and reassembled in proportions that violated every law of biology. Its limbs extended into the darkness beyond the door, into spaces that seemed to bend and warp around its passage. And its face, that lipless, eternal grin, was turned downward toward him, the burning eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made his knees weaken and his vision blur. "You want hunger," Scott said, and his voice was steady, clear, almost serene. "You want the emptiness, the need, the desperate, aching void that lives inside us. So take it, take all of it, but understand what I'm offering isn't what you think. I've already consumed myself. I've already stripped away everything that made me human. There's nothing left to eat. There's only the hunger itself." He held out his hands, the stumps emerging from the birch bark like offerings on a plate. "This is what I am now. This is what I made myself. A void, an absence, a hunger with no object. And if you consume me, you'll be consuming only hunger, only emptiness. You'll be eating your own nature." The Wendigo leaned closer. Its breath washed over him, carrying the smell of ancient decay and something else, something that might have been curiosity or might have been recognition. Its eyes, those terrible human eyes, narrowed, and for a moment, just a moment, Scott thought he saw something there that might have been doubt. Then it reached for him. The claws closed around his shoulders with a gentleness that was more horrible than any violence could have been. The Wendigo lifted him, raised him until his face was level with that grinning maw, until he could see down the infinite darkness of its throat, past the rows of teeth that receded into shadow like the pillars of some obscene cathedral. And it held him there, suspended, its eyes searching his, its mind pressing against his with a force that made his thoughts scatter like leaves in a hurricane. Scott didn't struggle. He didn't scream. He met the creature's gaze with an emptiness that was genuine, that was absolute, that was the product of 21 days of starvation and a lifetime of self-denial. He let the hunger fill him completely, let it consume every thought, every memory, every fragment of identity that remained. He became the void. He became the need. He became the very thing that the Wendigo had been seeking. And in that moment of total emptiness, he felt something shift. The pressure against his mind changed, becoming not less but different, becoming something that was no longer predatory but puzzled. The Wendigo was confused. It had found a vessel that was already empty, a meal that consisted entirely of appetite, and it didn't know how to consume what was already consumption itself. It dropped him. Scott fell to the floor of the cabin, landing hard on his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Wendigo stood over him, its head cocked to one side in an attitude of canine curiosity, its eyes burning with a light that was now tinged with something almost like frustration. It reached for him again, but its movements were slower, less certain, as if it were trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. "Go," Scott whispered, not knowing if the creature could understand, not knowing if it even possessed the capacity for language. "Go and find something else, something that still has substance, something that still bleeds when you cut it. I'm already dead. I've been dead for years. I just didn't know it." The Wendigo stared at him for a long moment, a moment that stretched into eternity, a moment in which Scott felt the full weight of its attention pressing down upon him like a physical force, like the atmosphere of a planet too massive for human survival. And then, with a sound that might have been a sigh, or might have been a growl, or might have been merely the shifting of ancient bones, it turned away. It moved through the door and into the snow, and as it passed, Scott felt something brush against his mind. Not a consumption, not a taking, but a marking, a branding. The Wendigo had not eaten him, but it had claimed him. It had tasted his emptiness and found it compatible, found it resonant, found it useful in ways that Scott couldn't comprehend. And as the creature vanished into the darkness, its footsteps fading into the distance, Scott understood that his sacrifice had not saved him. It had only changed the nature of his doom. He sat on the floor of the cabin, his ruined hands cradled in his lap, and felt the cold begin to creep inward. Not the cold of the winter night, but a deeper cold, a cold that originated in the space where his fingers had been and radiated outward until it encompassed his entire being. He was becoming the hunger. He was becoming the void. And somewhere in the distance, somewhere high in the canopy or deep beneath the frozen earth, the Wendigo was waiting for him to finish the transformation. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time had lost its meaning, its structure, its forward momentum. The fire died to embers and then to ash. The cold deepened, and slowly, inexorably, Scott felt his mind begin to change. The thoughts that had seemed so important, his career, his reputation, his desperate need to be right, began to fade, replaced by something simpler, something purer, something that was not thought at all but merely appetite. A constant, gnawing, all-consuming appetite that had no object, no satisfaction, no end. He found himself humming, a lullaby, something about mockingbirds and diamond rings. His mother's voice, or what he remembered of it, rising from depths he hadn't accessed in decades. The humming calmed the hunger, or perhaps it expressed it, gave it a form that was almost beautiful, almost bearable. He hummed and waited, and as the night wore on and the snow continued to fall, he felt something drawing near. Not the Wendigo, something else. Something that was coming for him specifically, that had been summoned by his sacrifice, his emptiness, his transformation into pure appetite. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that it was almost here. He could feel it in the spaces where his fingers had been, in the hollows behind his eyes, in the void that had opened at the center of his being and showed no signs of closing. "It's almost here," he whispered to the empty cabin, to the dead fire, to the snow that piled against the windows in drifts that would eventually bury the structure completely. "Can you hear it? It's just about to arrive." He gathered his fingers, his severed, frozen fingers, and arranged them in a neat pile on the floor beside him. They were beautiful in their way, perfect, complete. Everything that he had lost, everything that he had given up, everything that he had sacrificed in pursuit of a transcendence that had turned out to be indistinguishable from death. And then, because the hunger demanded it, because the emptiness required filling, because he was no longer Scott Anders but merely a vessel for the appetite that had consumed him, he picked up one of the fingers and placed it in his mouth. The taste was extraordinary, not because it was good, it was meat, it was himself, it was the ultimate taboo made flesh, but because it was familiar. It tasted like home, like completion, like the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life without knowing the words. He chewed and he hummed, and he waited for the beautiful hunger to arrive. Diana Crowley made it to the highway. She didn't know how. The snowmobile had started on the first try, its engine roaring into life with a sound that was almost obscene in the frozen silence, and she had driven south without looking back, without stopping, without thinking about the man she had left behind in the cabin with his pile of fingers and his impossible sacrifice. She had driven until the trees began to thin, until the sky began to lighten, until she saw the first glimmer of asphalt beneath the snow and knew that she had escaped. She didn't go to the police, not immediately. She was too afraid of what they would find, too afraid of what she would have to explain, too afraid that the contagion she could feel crawling beneath her skin would be visible to anyone who looked too closely. She hitchhiked to the nearest town, stole clothes from a laundromat, bought a bus ticket with cash she found in the pocket of the stolen jacket. She traveled for 3 days, changing buses, changing towns, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the northern woods. She ended up in Chicago. It was a city she had never visited, a city of glass and steel and light that seemed impossibly bright after the monochrome twilight of the woods. She found a cheap motel on the outskirts, a place where no one asked questions and the locks on the doors were purely decorative. She showered for an hour, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and pink, trying to wash away the smell of wood smoke and decay and the other thing, the thing that had settled into her pores like a stain that no solvent could remove. And then she went to a restaurant, a real restaurant, with white tablecloths and soft music, and a menu that offered more calories in a single entree than she had consumed in 3 weeks. She ordered without looking at the prices. Steak, rare, with a baked potato and butter and sour cream, and a basket of rolls that steamed when the waiter set them on the table. She ordered a glass of wine, red, expensive, the kind she had never been able to afford in her previous life. She sat across from an empty chair, and she waited for the hunger to return. It didn't, not the hunger she expected, not the physical, gnawing, desperate need for calories that had defined her existence for the past 3 weeks. That hunger was gone, replaced by something else, something deeper, something that looked at the steak and saw not sustenance but opportunity. She cut into the meat. It was perfect, seared on the outside and bleeding on the inside, exactly as she had ordered it. She raised the fork to her lips, felt the warmth of the food, smelled the iron-rich aroma of blood and protein. And she realized with a clarity that made her hand freeze in midair that she didn't want it. She didn't want the steak. She didn't want the potato. She didn't want the rolls or the wine or any of the 1,000 other items on the menu that had once seemed like the height of luxury. What she wanted, what she needed, was sitting at the table behind her. A young couple, laughing, sharing a dessert, their bodies radiating warmth and life, and the particular, irresistible scent of humanity that Diana had never noticed before but that now seemed overwhelming, intoxicating, essential. She wanted them. Not sexually, not socially, but fundamentally. She wanted to consume them. She wanted to strip away their warmth, their substance, their identities, and add them to the void that had opened inside her during those 21 days in the woods. She wanted to do to them what the Wendigo had done to Marcus and Elias, and was doing even now to Scott, to empty them, to hollow them out, to make them part of the hunger that was growing inside her with every passing moment. Diana lowered the fork. She set it on the plate with a click that seemed louder than the restaurant's ambient music, and she looked across the table at the empty chair, and she saw herself reflected in the polished silver of the bread basket. Her lips were tight, dry, starting to peel away at the corners, revealing not the wet pink of normal gum tissue but something else, something pale and hard and smooth, something that looked almost like bone. She reached up with a trembling hand and touched her mouth. Her lips felt wrong. They felt too thin, too rigid, too insufficient for the hunger that was building behind them. They felt like they were receding, withdrawing, exposing the teeth beneath in a way that should have been painful but wasn't. It felt natural. It felt right. It felt like the first stage of a transformation that had begun in the cabin and would continue here, in the city, in the heart of the civilization that had built its prosperity on the same hunger that the Wendigo represented. Because the Wendigo was not a single entity. Scott had been wrong about that, just as he had been wrong about so many things. The Wendigo was a contagion, a virus of appetite, a pattern of emptiness that replicated itself by consuming the identities of those it touched and then sending them forth as new carriers, new vectors, new mouths for the hunger to fill. Diana understood this now. She understood that Marcus hadn't been consumed, he had been converted, that Elias hadn't been killed, he had been recruited, that the faces around the Wendigo's neck were not trophies but badges, not victims but missionaries. And she understood that Scott, in his sacrifice, in his desperate attempt to confuse the creature, had only succeeded in becoming the purest expression of the contagion that had ever walked in human skin. She looked at her reflection again, at the lips that were peeling away, at the eyes that were darkening, dilating, beginning to glow with a light that was not reflection but emission, at the face that was still recognizably hers but was becoming something else, something older, something that had existed before the first human looked into a mirror and recognized itself as separate from the hunger. Across the restaurant, the young couple finished their dessert. They stood up, laughing, their bodies brushing against each other with the casual intimacy of people who had not yet learned that all touch is consumption, that all closeness is the beginning of a meal. They walked toward the door, and as they passed Diana's table, the young woman glanced at her and smiled, a quick, automatic gesture of social recognition that meant nothing and everything. Diana smiled back, and as she did, she felt her lips split, felt the skin crack and peel away in strips that landed on the white tablecloth like pale petals. She felt her mouth widening, felt her jaw unhinging in a way that human anatomy should not permit, felt the hunger rising from the void inside her with a force that was both terrifying and ecstatic. The young woman's smile faltered. Something in Diana's expression, something in the way she was looking at them, made her step closer to her partner, made her hand find his arm with a grip that was suddenly tight with fear. "Let's go," the woman whispered, and her voice was higher than it had been, threaded with a premonition she couldn't name. "I don't like this place." They went. Diana watched them go, and as the door closed behind them, she felt the hunger shift inside her, redirecting itself, focusing on a new target. She would follow them. Of course she would. That was the nature of the contagion. It followed. It remembered where you were trying to go, and when it caught you, when it finally cornered you in some dark place where the light couldn't reach, it didn't just consume you. It made you part of the feast. Diana stood up. She left a $20 bill on the table, though she had no idea if that was enough or too much, and she walked toward the door with a gait that was still mostly human but was becoming smoother, more fluid, more predatory with every step. Outside, the Chicago night was cold and clear, the stars visible above the light pollution in pinpricks of ancient light that had traveled millions of years to reach her eyes. She followed the couple down the street, keeping to the shadows, moving with a silence that she had not possessed a month ago. Her lips continued to peel, continued to recede, continued to expose the teeth beneath in a grin that was not yet lipless but was getting closer with every passing hour. And as she walked, she found herself humming. A lullaby, something about mockingbirds and diamond rings. The hunger was endless. The hunger was beautiful. And Diana Crowley, the sole survivor of the cabin in the northern woods, was finally ready to feed it. In the distance, barely audible above the city noise, something massive shifted in the darkness between two buildings. Something with limbs too long and a face that was learning, slowly but inevitably, to grin. The Wendigo had not stayed in the woods. The Wendigo had followed its newest disciple to the city, to the heart of the civilization that had tried to outgrow its appetites and had only succeeded in making them more sophisticated, more insatiable, more hungry. The feast was just beginning. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.